She was 6 years old, and nobody stopped. Not the woman in the red coat who glanced down and kept walking. Not the man in the suit who looked at his phone instead. Not the teenager who laughed at something on his screen and stepped around her like she was a crack in the sidewalk. For nearly 3 hours, a child sat alone on cold concrete beneath a dying neon light, and the world decided she wasn't its problem. Then the engines came. 7 of them, rolling out of the dark like something the town hadn't asked for and couldn't take back. If you want to know what happened to that little girl, and to the men who refused to leave her alone in the cold, stay until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. This one's going to stay with you. The neon sign above the Harmon Square supermarket had been half dead for 2 years. The H was dark. The S flickered every 4 seconds in a rhythm that felt almost biological, like a pulse too weak to sustain itself. The parking lot underneath it was cracked asphalt and old oil stains, and the kind of yellow light that made everyone look sick. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees since noon. The wind came in off the flat Ohio farmland with nothing to stop it. No hills, no tree line worth mentioning, just open cold that found every gap in your collar and pressed into the back of your neck like a warning. Lily Chun sat on the 3rd step of the concrete entrance staircase with her pink jacket pulled tight across her chest and her knees drawn up to her chin. She was 6 years old. Her sneakers were white with a small cartoon rabbit on each ankle, and they were soaked through from sitting in the thin puddle that had collected on the 2nd step, where the concrete had sunk slightly and cupped the rain. She had a small purple backpack, the kind kindergartners carry, the kind with a clip buckle across the chest that kids always forget to use. The buckle was unclipped. The backpack had slid to one side and was dangling off her left shoulder like it had given up. She wasn't crying anymore. She had been. Her face still held the tight, pale, wrecked look of a child who had been crying long enough to run out of it. Her eyes were red and slightly glassy, and she was staring at the parking lot entrance like she was waiting for something to come through it. She had been waiting for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The first person to walk past her had been a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket carrying a case of bottled water. He'd looked at her, looked away, kept moving. Maybe he assumed someone was coming. Maybe he didn't want to get involved. Maybe the weight of the water case made it easier to just keep walking. Whatever the reason, he was gone before the automatic doors even finished closing behind him. The second was a young woman in yoga pants and a puffy vest, talking into a wireless earbud. She'd glanced at Lily mid-sentence, faltered for just a moment, then kept talking and walked through the entrance without breaking her conversation. She came back out 9 minutes later with a small paper bag and walked directly to her car without looking at the steps. The third was a teenage boy, maybe 15, who'd actually made eye contact with Lily and then laughed. Not at her, probably, more from the discomfort of not knowing what to do. And then stepped to the far side of the entrance to avoid passing close to her. He disappeared into the parking lot without looking back. There were others. A couple arguing quietly who didn't notice her at all. An old man who moved slowly enough that he seemed to see her for a long moment, but then looked away with an expression that might have been exhaustion or might have been shame, and continued toward the sliding doors. A woman in scrubs who stopped, looked like she was going to say something, checked her phone, and then went inside. Nobody stopped. Nobody knelt down. Nobody said, "Hey, you okay? Where's your mom? You need help." The town of Carver Falls, Ohio, had a population of just under 14,000 people. It had a chamber of commerce and a high school football team and a banner on Main Street that said, "Community Strong" in navy blue and gold. It had a Facebook group for local announcements and a neighborhood watch program that had been active for 6 years. It had all the visible machinery of a place that looked after its own. And a 6-year-old girl had been sitting alone on a concrete step for nearly 3 hours in October, and the machinery had not engaged. That mattered. That mattered in a way that would become important later. The specific texture of how a community could look like care and function like indifference. But at 7:14 p.m. on that Tuesday, it was still just a cold fact, like the cracked asphalt and the flickering S and the puddle soaking into the heels of Lily Chun's cartoon rabbit sneakers. Then the sound came. It didn't announce itself politely. It didn't build from a gentle hum. It arrived fully formed from somewhere down Route 9, a low rolling thunder that Lily felt in her sternum before she heard it clearly, The deep synchronized percussion of multiple large engines moving together at highway speed and then decelerating into the parking lot approach. She lifted her head. 7 motorcycles came through the entrance in a loose formation, headlights cutting yellow paths through the parking lot, dark. They were big machines, full touring Harleys and 2 custom builds with exhaust pipes that ran high and wide, and they moved with a specific kind of unhurried authority, the way things move when they don't need to perform speed because the weight alone makes the point. The engines dropped to idle as they spread into a section of the lot near the entrance, and the sound became a low collective rumble before, one by one, the engines cut. Silence pressed in around the edges. 7 men swung off their bikes. They were not small men. They were not young men, most of them. They wore cut-off leather vests over heavy jackets, road-worn and patched. The leather cracked at the elbows and darkened in ways that suggested years, not months. Several had faces that carried the specific density of men who had been through things they didn't talk about in certain company. Scars, jaw tension, eyes that moved across a space before the rest of the face did. The man who had been at the front of the formation was the last to fully stand from his bike. His name was Boone Mercer. He was 47 years old, which meant nothing until you looked at him closely, at which point it meant everything. He was built like someone who had been strong young and had chosen to remain that way through deliberate effort rather than vanity. Broad through the shoulders, with the kind of neck that comes from military service and years of hauling equipment. His hair was dark with heavy gray at the temples, and he wore it close cut. His face had a prominent jaw and deep-set eyes that were the particular color of slate in low light. Not quite gray, not quite blue. Something in between that made people uncertain what they were seeing. He had a scar along his left jawline. Not dramatic. Just there. Like a note someone had written and never erased. He wore a president's patch on his vest. The club was called the Iron Hollow Riders, and they were based out of Columbus. And if you'd asked anyone in Carver Falls about them before this evening, you would have gotten a range of responses that probably said more about the people responding than about the club itself. What was true was what could be seen. 7 men, mid-30s to early 50s, who had ridden together for years and who knew exactly how they read to a room and had made a kind of peace with that long ago. Boone was scanning the lot as he walked toward the store entrance. Not paranoid scanning, just the habitual awareness of a man trained to know what was in his environment. 2 other bikers were flanking him loosely, talking about something low and private. The rest were moving toward the entrance at varying speeds, one of them already pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket that looked like a list. Then Boone saw Lily. He stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. Full stop. Mid-stride. The man to his left, a younger guy, late 30s, tattoos visible on his neck, who went by the name Rook, noticed and stopped a half-second later, following Boone's eyeline. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The child on the steps had noticed them. She was watching them with the particular stillness of a small animal that has decided that freezing is the safest response to an unknown threat. Her backpack had slid further off her shoulder. Her hands were pressed flat against the concrete step on either side of her. Boone handed his helmet to Rook without taking his eyes off the girl. He walked to the steps alone. He didn't approach fast. He gave her distance, came to the bottom step, and crouched down so his eye level dropped below hers. An instinct, something he'd probably never consciously thought about, but had been doing with frightened children since Afghanistan, when the calculus of making yourself smaller in the presence of fear had been survival knowledge for everyone in the theater. He rested his forearms on his knees. He wasn't touching anything. He was just down there, looking up at her instead of down. The cold wind moved between them. "You okay, kid?" he said. His voice was low, not soft in a performed way, just low, the way voices go when something serious is being acknowledged without being dramatized. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Her lower lip was doing something complicated. "My mom went in," she said. She didn't come back. Boone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not from impatience, from something else. "How long ago?" Lily looked at the parking lot. She didn't have a watch. "A long time," she said. Behind Boone, Rook had moved a few steps closer and was listening without approaching. A second biker, a heavy-set man named Dex Foley, who had a gray beard cut close and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a mechanic who read too much, had stopped near the bottom of the steps. The others were pausing at the entrance, reading the situation without being told. Boone looked at the child and understood. Not the whole situation, not yet, but the immediate shape of it. A little girl, alone in the cold. A mother who'd gone inside and not returned. The way Lily was looking at the parking lot entrance told him she'd been watching it for a while. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily." "I'm Boone." He didn't offer a hand, just the name, like an equal. "Your mom shop here a lot?" Lily nodded. "Every Tuesday. She gets the chicken." She paused. "The one in the plastic." "The rotisserie?" She nodded again, more certain now that vocabulary had reconnected something. "Okay," Boone said. "We're going to find her. You want to wait right here while we go look inside? Or you want to come with us?" He asked her. He didn't tell her, didn't assume, didn't scoop her up and carry her. He asked. Lily considered this with the gravity of a child who had been forced to think like a small adult for the last several hours. "Come with," she said. Boone stood. He held his hand out, palm up, fingers slightly curled, not reaching for her, just there. Lily looked at it for a second, then put her small hand in it. They went through the sliding doors together. The store was bright in the particular assaulting way of supermarkets. Fluorescent tubes running the full length of the ceiling, every aisle lit to the same flat, shadowless intensity that erased depth and made the space feel simultaneously vast and airless. The smell was that specific supermarket mixture of produce, cold, and cleaning product, and the warm exhaust from the deli ovens at the back. A tinny pop song from 6 years ago was running on the overhead speakers at a volume calibrated to be heard but not noticed. The bikers spread loosely through the entrance area without being told how. Boone walked Lily toward the customer service desk, where a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head was dealing with a coupon dispute. The customer in front of her was insistent. The woman behind the counter had the face of someone who had been dealing with coupon disputes for 15 years and had decided that every one of them was equally meaningful, which was to say, not very. Boone waited. Rook didn't wait. He was already moving toward the back of the store. The woman at the customer service desk finished with the coupon and looked up. And when she saw Boone, she did a thing that people often did, which was an involuntary recalibration. The slight widening of the eyes, the reassessment of the immediate situation. He was large. He was wearing a cut with patches, and he was holding the hand of a small child who looked like she'd been crying. "There a problem?" she said. Automatic, defensive. The voice of a woman who had called security before. "Little girl's been outside alone for a while," Boone said. "Her mom came in here and didn't come back. We're going to help find her." "Her mom?" The woman looked at Lily. "What's your mom's name, honey?" "Sarah," Lily said. "Sarah Chun." The woman turned to her computer, tapped some keys, looked back up. "I can call a manager." "That'd be useful," Boone said. The manager who arrived 3 minutes later was a man named Greg Whitfield, who had the energy of someone recently promoted and not yet certain how to perform the confidence the title required. He was wearing a dress shirt with the store logo and a tie that had been loosened slightly, and he looked at Boone the way people looked at Boone when they were trying to decide if they were in danger. "I understand there's a missing person situation," Greg said. "Child's mother came in approximately 3 hours ago," Boone said. "Hasn't come out. Girl's been sitting outside alone." He paused. "We'd like to see your security footage." Greg blinked. "I'm sorry, that's really not something we can just—" "Greg!" Boone's voice hadn't changed volume. It hadn't gotten harder. Something had shifted in it, though. Something that said, "We can do this the way that wastes time or the other way. There's a little girl right here. Her mother is somewhere in this building or was. Every minute we spend on policy is a minute her mother doesn't have." Greg looked at Lily. Lily looked at Greg with red-rimmed eyes. Greg made the decision that the correct PR response was to cooperate and said, "Follow me." The security office was a small room behind the customer service area with 2 monitors displaying split feeds from the store's camera network. There were 12 cameras total: entrance, each main aisle, the deli, the back stockroom entrance, and the rear exterior. The system recorded on a 48-hour loop. Greg pulled up the rear exterior feed and cued it back to roughly the window in question. Another biker had materialized in the doorway by this point. His name was Eli Kane, but nobody called him that. Everybody called him Cypher, a name he'd acquired before the club, back in a previous life that he referred to obliquely and rarely. He was 39 and lean in the way of someone whose metabolism had been set permanently to running speed by years of high-stress work, and he had the slightly unfocused look of a man whose attention was almost always somewhere his eyes weren't. He carried a small tablet in a worn case, and he moved through spaces as if he'd already mapped them. He stepped into the security office and looked at the monitors and said, "That system's locally archived, not cloud. I can pull more than the loop if Greg gives me the access panel." Greg looked at Cypher. "Are you with law enforcement?" "No." "Then I can't just—" "I'm telling you what your system can do," Cypher said without heat. "What you do with that is your call." Boone said quietly, "Pull the rear exterior. Last 3 hours." Greg pulled it. The footage was grainy in the way of systems that had been installed as a security theater gesture rather than an actual security investment. The rear exit of the Harmon Square supermarket opened onto a narrow service alley that ran along the back of the building. Delivery bays, dumpsters, the infrastructure of retail that existed specifically to be invisible. The alley was lit by a single overhead fixture that left deep shadows at both ends. They watched in silence. At 4:41 p.m., a woman appeared in the frame. She had come through the rear exit door, the one marked Employees Only, the one that locked from the outside so customers couldn't typically access it. She was small, Asian, wearing a dark coat and carrying a canvas shopping bag. She had the hurried look of someone who had just been told something and was still processing it. Behind her, 2 men emerged from the door almost immediately. Not store employees. They were wearing street clothes, one in a dark jacket, one in a gray hoodie, and they moved in the way of men who were escorting rather than following. One of them reached out and put a hand on the woman's arm as she moved toward the alley exit. She pulled her arm back. He put it back. The second man stepped to her other side. The woman, Sarah Chun, because it had to be, because the math was not complicated, stopped walking. She said something. Whatever it was, the man in the dark jacket responded, and his body language was the body language of a conversation that only one party thought was optional. They led her to the alley exit. A car was waiting. The timestamp read 4:44 p.m. 3 minutes. From rear exit to gone, 3 minutes. Lily had been sitting outside on the front steps for 2 hours and 49 minutes when the bikers had arrived. Nobody said anything in the security office for a moment. Boone was the first to move. He looked at Cypher and something passed between them that wasn't a conversation, but was a full communication. Cypher was already pulling out his tablet. "Plate on the car," Boone said. "Partial," Cypher said. "Ohio. First 3 characters are visible. Give me the frame." Greg Whitfield was standing by the door to the security office with the expression of a man whose Tuesday had turned into something he hadn't agreed to when he'd taken the assistant manager position. He said carefully, "I think we need to call the police." "Yes," Boone said. "You should do that." He said it without irony. He meant it. The police needed to know this, needed to be in the loop, needed to be doing whatever the police did in a situation like this. But there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not planning to wait. Rook appeared in the doorway behind Cypher. "Called Harmon County, non-emergency," he said. "Dispatch said unit response is 40 to 50 minutes, maybe. Night shift is short." Boone looked at Lily. She was standing beside him, still holding his hand, looking at the screen where her mother had just been led to a car by 2 men. Her face had gone very still and very young in a way that was different from how she'd looked outside. Outside, she'd been frightened and exhausted. Now she was something else. Something that didn't have a word in 6-year-old vocabulary, but that adults recognized because they'd seen it before. She was understanding something she wasn't ready to understand. "Hey," Boone said quietly. Lily looked up at him. "We're going to find her." He didn't add qualifiers. He didn't say we'll try or we'll do our best. He said we're going to find her with the voice of a man who had made promises in worse places than this and had kept them. Dex appeared from the main store floor, leaning through the office doorway. "Got a witness," he said. "Stock guy named Paolo. Says those two men have been in the store 3 times this month. Always at the same time, always leave out the back. You know who they are? Says they come in talking to the assistant manager. Not Greg, the other one. Guy named Terrence Briggs. Boone looked at Greg. Greg looked like he wished he was still handling coupon disputes. Where's Terrence right now, Boone asked. Greg checked his phone. He left at 4, said he had a family thing. He'd leave before or after those men came through. Greg's face did something involuntary. He checked his phone again as though it might give him a better answer. After, he said. After. The cold came through the walls in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Cypher had the partial plate, and he was running it through something on his tablet. Boone didn't ask what. Had learned years ago that the specifics of what Cypher did with technology were better understood in terms of outcomes than process. What he knew was that Cypher had a specific set of skills assembled over a previous career that he referenced with exactly 2 words: prior service. What branch, what unit, what specifically? Those weren't conversations Cypher had. What the skills were, those were evident. Boone crouched back down to Lily's level. You remember anything your mom said before she went in? Anything she was worried about? Lily thought about it with her whole face. She was on the phone in the car, she said. She was talking quiet. When I asked what she was saying, she said it was grown-up stuff. What kind of grown-up stuff? Lily shook her head. She didn't say. She looked. She paused, searching for the word with the care of a child who had learned that words were sometimes the only way to make adults understand. She looked scared, Lily said, but she was pretending she wasn't. The way she said it, with that small, precise observation, hit the room differently than if an adult had said it. A child of 6 had watched her mother perform calm over fear on the drive to the grocery store and had known what she was seeing and had chosen to let her mother have the performance rather than question it. Rook, in the doorway, looked at the floor. Dex put his hands in his jacket pockets and turned to look at the security monitors. Boone held it on his face as long as he needed to, then straightened. Cypher, he said, working on it. What do you need? Internet connection that isn't the store's, and 10 minutes. Dex said, I'll hotspot. They moved out of the security office, back into the brightness of the store. A small group of shoppers had congregated near the customer service desk at a careful distance, 3 people, 4, doing the thing that people do when something has happened in a public space and they're trying to understand it without being seen to be watching. One of them, a woman in her late 20s with a phone held at the angle of someone recording, said loudly enough to be heard, Someone should call the police. There's bikers surrounding that little girl. Boone looked at her. She didn't lower the phone. Police have been called, Boone said. By us. About 40 minutes ago, we estimate, is when a woman was taken from the rear exit of this building. He looked at the small cluster of observers. If any of you saw 2 men in the store between 4 and 4:45, dark jacket, gray hoodie, we'd appreciate knowing it. Silence. The woman kept recording. Nobody offered anything. Boone turned back to the group. He'd expected that. It wasn't bitterness, just data. In his experience, the people who stood the safest distance from a problem were most often the ones who most loudly insisted they would have acted differently in someone else's shoes. Outside, through the glass entrance, he could see the parking lot. His 7 bikes sat in a row in the far section, chrome catching the flickering light of the half-dead neon sign. A car had slowed on the street, someone driving past, looking in, making the same calculation the woman with the phone was making. Boone had been read as dangerous his entire adult life. He'd made peace with that in his late 20s. The patch on his chest said President and meant something specific within the Iron Hollow Riders and meant something entirely different to the woman recording him on her phone. He existed in that gap between what he was and what he read as, with the steadiness of a man who had learned that you could not spend energy managing other people's fear of you. You just kept doing the thing you were doing and let the outcomes speak. He'd been doing the thing for a long time. Cypher had moved to the end of an aisle and was seated on the floor with his back against the frozen food section, tablet open, fingers moving. Dex stood nearby, providing the hotspot connection, looking bored in the particular way of a man who had waited in worse places. Boone sat on the floor next to Cypher, which put him close to Lily, who had taken a seat in the aisle too, back against the frozen food case, holding her knees to her chest. "You hungry?" Boone said. Lily shook her head. "You sure? We've been around motorcycles all day. We could eat." She thought about this. "What do you eat?" Rook over there once ate a gas station hot dog that had been on the roller for 6 hours. Lily's face did something that was almost a smile and wasn't quite. "That's gross," she said. "Yeah," Boone said. "We told him. He said it had character." Rook, from the next aisle over, said, "It was fine." Lily looked in the direction of Rook's voice. "Was it really fine?" A pause. "It was extremely not fine," Rook said. This time she did smile, small, quick, like she'd caught herself doing it and wasn't sure if it was allowed tonight. But it happened. Boone filed it away. Cypher said, "Got something." He turned the tablet. On the screen was a business registration document, the kind available through Ohio's Public Commercial Records database. It was for an entity called Pinnacle Capital Solutions, LLC, registered in Franklin County. The registration address was a suite number in a Columbus office building. The registered agent was a name, Victor A. Hale. "Hale's a local name," Cypher said. "Old money. His family's been in Harmon County since the 70s. He runs what looks like a consumer lending operation out of multiple shell companies. Predatory is too soft a word for some of what I'm looking at." "And Sarah Chun's connection to him?" Cypher pulled up a second window. "Working on that." He paused. "There's a state court docket, Harmon County. Small claims filing last year. Pinnacle Capital Solutions as plaintiff against a Sarah E. Chun." He looked up. "For a debt of $11,200. Boone sat with that. "Loan she couldn't pay back," Rook said from around the corner, arriving fully now, crouching at the end of the aisle. "Or couldn't pay because the terms were designed so she couldn't," Cypher said. "I've seen this before. Variable rates buried in the fine print that activate after a promotional period. By the time the borrower realizes what the actual interest structure looks like, they're 6 months in and the penalties have compounded the principal by 40%. He closed 2 windows and opened another. The case was continued twice, then settled, which means she paid them something. He looked at Boone. "Or agreed to something." "Or was pressured to agree to something," Dex said. "And now they're pressuring her again," Rook said. Boone looked at Lily. She was listening to all of this with the expression of a child who was absorbing more than she was supposed to. Smart eyes, the kind that filed things away. "Cypher," Boone said. "Those men in the footage, where do they go?" "That's what I'm working on. Plate's partial, but I've got the vehicle make. It's a dark blue Dodge Charger, 2019 or 2020, the front-end refresh model. There's a traffic camera on Route 9 at the Kellerman Road intersection. Harmon County doesn't have a great camera network, but they've got that one because it feeds into the state traffic management system." He was typing. "If they went east on Route 9, we'll have a full plate in about..." He paused. "There." He turned the tablet. "Full plate, Ohio." He ran it. The vehicle came back registered to a company, not a person. A property management LLC with a Columbus address. Different company name than Pinnacle Capital. But Cypher was already cross-referencing and within 90 seconds had found the shared registered agent. Victor Hale again. "He's careful," Cypher said. "Multiple shells, lots of layers between him and anything traceable on paper." He scrolled. "But not careful enough." "Route 9 East," Boone said. "Where does that go?" Rook pulled his phone and brought up the map. "Farmland for about 8 miles. Then you hit the Kellerman Industrial Park. Old factory district. Most of the buildings have been vacant since the mid-2000s. He turned the screen. "There's a cluster of warehouses on the east end. Access road isn't well maintained. Satellite shows it overgrown on the shoulders. Not getting regular traffic." He paused. "But there's a recent Google Street View capture from a mapping vehicle. One of the warehouse lots has a new padlock on the access gate. Chain looks new in the photo." Boone stood. He looked at the tablet. He looked at the map. He looked at Rook and Dex and Cypher, and then at the front entrance of the store where the other 3 members of the Iron Hollow Riders were stationed. Bull, and a man they called Ghost, and a quiet, deliberate man named Sal, who had been a paramedic for 11 years before he'd been the other thing. Then he looked at Lily. "You're going to stay here with Dex," Boone said, "and 2 of our guys. Dex is going to find you something to eat that isn't a 6-hour hot dog. The police are coming, and when they get here, you're going to tell them your name and tell them your mom's name and tell them what you told us, okay? Lily looked at him. Are you going to find my mom? She said. Boone held her gaze. Yeah, he said. That's where we're going. Lily looked at him for another long moment with those dark, serious eyes. Then she looked at Dex. Dex pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up and said, I saw they have good cheese crackers in aisle 4. Oh, Lily considered this. What kind? The kind in the individual bags, Dex said. The ones with the little fish on the packages. Those are good, Lily said quietly. Yeah, Dex said. They are. Outside, Boone moved through the sliding doors into the cold. The parking lot wind found the gap at his collar immediately. He zipped the jacket. He looked at the row of bikes. Bull was waiting near the machines, thick-armed ex-correctional officer, a man of very few words and excellent spatial awareness. Ghost was there too. Thin, pale, tattooed from collar to cuff, the one who got his name because he had a specific talent for being in spaces without registering as a presence. Sal stood slightly apart, as he usually did, looking at the road with the expression of someone doing distance calculations. Cypher and Rook emerged behind Boone. Nobody needed a full briefing. They'd all been inside. They'd all heard enough. 6 of us, Boone said. Cypher navigates. Sal rides drag, keeps radio line open for the police frequency. He looked at each of them. We go in quiet. We don't know what we're riding into. I want eyes before anyone moves. He looked at Ghost. Which means you earn your name. Ghost didn't smile, but something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Kellerman Industrial, Cypher said. 8.4 miles. 12 minutes at legal speed. We're not speeding, Boone said. He put his helmet on. The bikes came to life sequentially. Not all at once, but one by one, each engine adding its voice to the accumulated low thunder until all 6 were running. The sound in the empty parking lot was the sound of something that had made up its mind. Boone looked back at the supermarket once. Through the glass, he could see the bright interior. He could see Dex standing in an aisle with a small figure next to him. He could see, even at this distance, the backpack still hanging off one shoulder. He looked away. He pulled out of the lot onto Route 9 East, and the others fell in behind him, and the October dark swallowed them whole. 6 machines and 6 riders moving through cold farmland toward a warehouse at the edge of town, following a chain of digital breadcrumbs that ended at a woman tied to a chair, signing documents she hadn't chosen, or would not choose but might be made to choose anyway if nobody arrived in time. The engines ran low in the cold air. Chrome caught the moonlight. Nobody spoke. There was a thin fog beginning to form over the flat fields, rising in slow curtains from the harvested ground, and the headlights of the bikes pushed through it without quite clearing it, leaving tunnels of illuminated vapor that closed again immediately behind each machine. The road was empty. 8 miles. 12 minutes. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, behind a new padlock on a gate that shouldn't need a new padlock, a woman was sitting in a chair in a building that was supposed to be vacant, listening to a man explain to her exactly how much she owed and what would happen if she didn't sign, while her 6-year-old daughter sat in a bright supermarket eating cheese crackers with a biker who wore wire-rimmed glasses and read too much, and had a gray beard and had not once in 40 minutes, let the child feel like she was alone. The fog thickened. Boone leaned into a curve and felt the cold press into the front of his jacket, and in the space behind his sternum, where the weight usually lived, the weight of a life that had been full of wrong places and right decisions and wrong decisions, and people he hadn't saved and people he felt something compress and go tight and still. He'd been here before. Not this road, not this town, but this feeling, the feeling of riding toward something that couldn't be undone, of being the thing standing between someone and the worst version of tonight. He'd been here enough times that he knew its shape. What he didn't know yet was what was waiting for them on the other side of the gate. What he didn't know was that the warehouse held more than one secret. What he didn't know was that the man named Victor Hale had not worked alone in this county for 11 years without some measure of protection, and that protection was not only in the form of hired muscle. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, riding through the October fog on Route 9 toward the Kellerman Industrial Park, was that one of the vehicles currently parked in front of that warehouse belonged to someone with a badge. The engines ran, the fog rose, and 12 minutes stood between the Iron Hollow riders and everything that was about to happen next. The fog had gotten worse in the last 4 miles. It came up from the fields on both sides of Route 9 in slow, thick curtains, the kind that didn't move when you rode through it but simply parted and rejoined behind you, indifferent. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees since they'd left the supermarket parking lot. Boone could feel it in his knuckles despite the gloves. A deep, specific cold that found the joints and settled in like it owned them. He'd ridden in worse. Much worse. But there was a particular quality to Ohio cold in October that was less about the number on a thermometer and more about the flatness, the nothing around you, the way the cold had nowhere to be except everywhere. The industrial park appeared first as a change in the skyline, or rather, a change in the absence of skyline. Where the flat fields had been, darker shapes began to rise. The silhouettes of buildings, long, low structures with flat roof lines and the occasional rusted water tower or ventilation stack. No lights in the windows, no movement, the kind of structures that had been built when something was happening in a place and had been maintained at the minimum threshold required to call them still standing once the something stopped happening. Cypher's voice came through the earpiece. They were running a simple group channel, nothing encrypted, just enough for communication without phones. Access road is the second left past the Kellerman sign. The gate's another 200 yards in. Boone clicked once, acknowledged. He took the left and felt the road quality change immediately beneath the tires. Rougher, less maintained, the asphalt giving way to something that was more in tension than surface, cracked and heaved and patched with gravel in sections where the worst breaks had been filled but not properly repaired. The bike slowed. At this speed, in this dark, on this road, there were 6 points of light moving through a place that did not want to be found. The gate was where Rook had said it would be. Chain link, maybe 8 feet high, with a horizontal bar across the middle for structural integrity. The new padlock was visible even at distance. It caught the headlights in a way that the rest of the gate didn't, brighter, less corroded. On the other side of the gate, the access road continued for another 30 yards before it reached the first warehouse building. There were no lights on in the building itself, but around the far corner, just barely visible, just enough to register as a difference in the darkness, was the faint suggestion of light from somewhere behind the structure. And 2 vehicles were parked inside the gate, both visible through the chain link, a dark blue Dodge Charger, which was expected, and a white Ford F25. With a light bar on the cab roof, which was not. Boone brought his bike to a stop 10 yards from the gate and cut the engine. The others came in behind him and stopped in a ragged line and cut their engines too. And the sudden silence was the silence of a road that had never been designed for silence, all cracked asphalt and dead weeds and the thin sound of the fog moving. Nobody said anything for a moment. They all looked at the F250. Rook was the first. He came up alongside Boone, close enough to speak without the earpiece, his voice below a breath. "That's a county vehicle." "I can see that." Sheriff's Department runs the same package on their F-Series, light bar configuration, the antenna placement. "That's a Sheriff's Department truck, Boone." "I know." Another silence. Ghost had materialized on Boone's other side without anyone hearing him move. It was the thing about Ghost. You didn't track him arriving, you just looked, and he was there. He was looking at the F250 with narrowed eyes. "Doesn't mean it's a dirty cop," he said. "Could be someone called it in already. Could be a deputy made the scene." "Could be," Boone said. But if it was a deputy responding to a call, there'd be lights, and the vehicle would be out front, not inside a locked gate. He looked at Rook. "You get in touch with the county dispatch relay Sal was monitoring?" Rook checked his phone. "Sal says no active calls to this location in the last 6 hours. Nothing dispatched out here tonight." Ghost looked at the truck again. "So whoever's in there with that truck," Rook said, "they're here because they chose to be here." Boone sat with that for 4 seconds. He was very still. The way he got still when he was doing the most work, when the calculations were running fastest and the exterior was the calmest. The others had learned to read this. When Boone went still and quiet, it meant the situation had upgraded. "Cypher," he said, touching the earpiece. "Yeah." I need you to do something that you might not love. A pause. How much won't I love it? The vehicle registration databases for county law enforcement vehicles in Ohio are accessible through the state's public safety portal. I know you have login credentials for that portal from the period in your life you don't talk about. A longer pause. You're asking me to run a plate on a cop truck. I'm asking you to find out whose truck is parked inside a locked gate in a vacant industrial lot next to a car connected to the disappearance of a woman. Silence on the line. Then the sound of keys. While Cypher worked, Boone looked at the gate. It was padlocked, but the frame had some flex. The uprights were older than the lock, set in concrete that had heaved slightly from frost cycles over the years. Not enough to push through. But the hinges on the swing side were surface-mounted, not welded. That mattered. He became aware of Sal pulling up alongside him. Sal was 44 and had a deliberate way of moving that came from years of working emergencies. Controlled motion, nothing wasted. The economy of someone who had learned that panic was expensive. He had a full sleeve on his left arm and a burn scar along the right side of his neck that he never explained. He'd been a paramedic for 11 years before he'd lost his certification under circumstances that, within the Iron Hollow Riders, were both known and never discussed aloud. He carried a medical kit in his saddlebag at all times. He had never once been asked to leave it behind. "If someone's inside and they're hurt," Sal said. "I know. I need to be first in that door. You'll be right behind Ghost." Sal looked at the building. "How much force are we expecting?" "Don't know yet." Boone. "Don't know yet, Sal." Cypher's voice in the earpiece. "Got it." A pause that had texture, the kind of pause that carried information before the words did. "The F-250 is registered to Harmon County Sheriff's Department, Unit 14, current assigned operator." Another pause. "Deputy Marcus Teal, 14-year veteran. No disciplinary record on public file." Boone said, But I went sideways into the county's vendor payment records, which are public technically, just buried." The sound of more typing. "Pinnacle Capital Solutions has made 3 payments to an LLC called MT Consulting in the last 18 months. Total amount just under $31,000. Cypher stopped. MT Consulting is registered to a Marcus Teal. The fog moved around them. Nobody spoke. Rook made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Bull, who had said nothing since they'd left the supermarket, said quietly and without particular emotion, "So we got a dirty cop inside." "We've got a deputy who has been receiving payments from the man who took Sarah Chun," Boone said. "What he's doing in there tonight, we don't know." "We know enough," Rook said. Boone looked at him. "We know he's not here on department business," Rook said. "We know he's been on Hale's payroll. We know a woman is in that building, and she's been there for 3 hours. He paused. "Boone, we know enough." The thing about Rook, his real name was Danny Ferris, and he'd been with the Iron Hollow Riders for 9 years, and before that he'd been in places where the calculation between knowing enough and waiting for certainty had cost people their lives. He had a short fuse that was attached to a genuine protective instinct, which meant it was the most dangerous kind of short fuse. It was never purely aggression. It was always aggression in service of something, which made it harder to argue with. Boone understood all of this. He also understood that riding 6 men into a warehouse where an armed deputy was present, whatever that deputy's loyalties were, was not a situation that resolved cleanly. Not for Sarah. Not for any of them. "Here's what we're not going to do," Boone said. "We're not going to go through that gate loud and fast and give anyone inside a reason to make a decision they can't take back. If Teal is in there as muscle, he's armed. If he feels cornered, if we go in slow," Rook said, "they have time. They've had 3 hours. Boone, if she was in immediate danger, we'd already be past this conversation." He looked at Rook directly. "She's in there because they need something from her. They can't get it from her if she's—" He stopped. He looked away. "They need her to sign, which means they need her functional, which means we have time to go in the right way." Rook held the eye contact for a moment, then looked away. But something had shifted in the group. Boone felt it, the specific temperature change of men who trusted him and were beginning to calculate the distance between trust and disagreement. He'd felt it before, in worse circumstances than this. It was not a comfortable feeling, but he'd learned to receive it as information rather than threat. "Ghost," he said. Ghost was already looking at the gate with the expression of someone who had already figured out the entry. "The hinge side," Ghost said. "Yeah. Give me 4 minutes." He moved. He didn't go to the gate directly. He went to the fence line, 20 feet to the left of the gate, and moved along it with a kind of unhurried precision until he found the section he was looking for, where the fencing had pulled slightly from a bottom rail, a gap of maybe 4 inches between the chain link and the ground. Not enough to slide through, but Ghost crouched and put his hands on the fence fabric and pulled, and the corroded bottom rail gave with a low groan, and the gap became 8 inches, and then a foot. He went flat and through it like water finding a crack. On the other side, he stood, brushed gravel from his jacket, and moved toward the gate from the inside without any apparent hurry. Boone watched. The padlock on the gate was a combination model, not keyed, but the hinge on the far side was surface-mounted. 2 bolts through a steel plate, the plate screwed to the aging wooden frame post. Ghost produced something from his jacket, assessed the hinge bolts for a moment, and began working. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the gate swung inward from the hinge side. He hadn't touched the lock. Boone walked his bike through rather than starting it. The others did the same. 6 men walking 6 motorcycles through a gate in the dark. The only sounds, the soft crunch of tire on gravel, and the occasional clink of metal and the fog closing around them. They left the bikes 20 yards inside the gate, parked in a line facing the exit. Not staged for getaway. Staged for availability. There was a difference, and everyone there understood it. They went the rest of the way on foot. The warehouse building was long and low and had been some kind of manufacturing facility in a previous decade. The bones of it were still visible in the loading dock infrastructure along the near side. The steel roll-up doors now padlocked shut, the dock plates rusted in place. The faint light they'd seen from the road was coming from the far end, where one of the roll-up doors had been replaced at some point with a standard man door, and thin light escaped from beneath it. Ghost was already at the corner of the building, pressed flat, looking around it at the door. He came back and held up 3 fingers. 3 people visible at or near the door. Boone nodded. Ghost went back to the corner. Boone looked at his men. He pointed to Sal and made a gesture. "Stay at depth. Be ready." Sal acknowledged. He pointed to Bull and indicated the far side of the building, a flanking position, coverage of the other exits, of which satellite imagery had shown 2. Bull moved without a word, dissolving into the dark around the building's corner. He looked at Rook. Rook looked back at him. "Stay with me," Boone said, quiet as he could. "I'm always with you," Rook said. "Doesn't mean I agree." "You don't have to agree." Something passed over Rook's face, something old, something that lived below the surface of his usual expression and didn't get out often. He said, "If she's hurt in there, then Sal handles it and we get her out. That's the sequence." "And Teal?" "Evidence, not confrontation. Cypher handles what Teal doesn't know is happening. We get Sarah out and we hand everything to federal investigators, not county. You understand why?" Rook understood. If Teal was county and Hale owned county, giving it to county was giving it to Hale. Federal was the only route that didn't circle back to the same table. Cypher, 3 yards back, had his tablet out and was running something over the hotspot with a calm that was either professional conditioning or something adjacent to dissociation. Probably both. "I've already started a file transfer to a contact at the FBI's Columbus field office," he said, barely above a whisper. "Financial records, the footage, the plate cross-reference, the payment records connecting Teal to Pinnacle. The moment we have confirmation Sarah is in that building, I send it." "What do you need for confirmation?" "Someone open that door." Boone looked at Ghost, who was still at the corner watching the door. Ghost looked back. Boone gave a small nod. Ghost went around the corner. What happened next took 40 seconds. Ghost moved along the warehouse wall in the dark, tight against the surface, using the building's shadow, in the portion of the approach where the light from under the door was directional and didn't reach. He got to within 6 feet of the door, stopped, listened. Then he came back. 3 inside set, he said, voice so low it was almost shaped breath. 2 standing, 1 seated. The one seated is a woman. She's not moving around. Boone's chest tightened. Conscious? Sal, from behind them. Couldn't tell. You heard voices? One male, steady. One male, short responses. The woman? Nothing. Boone breathed in through his nose. The air tasted like cold gravel and old rust and something chemical from whatever had been manufactured in this building years ago. He held the breath. Let it out. He thought about Lily. He thought about a 6-year-old sitting in a supermarket aisle eating cheese crackers with Dex, waiting, having been told we're going to find her by a man who did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. He thought about the weight of that. He thought about all the other things he carried, the weight that lived under his sternum, the specific inventory of people he hadn't reached in time, and he held all of it in the space of one breath and then set it aside, because that was the mechanism, the thing he'd built over years that let him function. You held it. You acknowledged it. You set it aside. Not forever, just for now. We're going in, he said. He walked around the corner and directly to the door. No ceremony, no count. No signal beyond his own movement, which the others had learned to read as signal enough. He pushed the door open. The inside of the warehouse was lit by 2 work lights on stands, the portable kind, battery-powered, directional, set up to illuminate a central area while the rest of the building remained in deep shadow. The central area was a cleared section of the concrete floor, roughly 20 feet across, surrounded by the debris of a long vacant industrial space. Rusted shelving units, broken pallet stacks, the skeletal remains of machinery long since stripped for parts. In the center of the cleared area was a metal folding chair. Sarah Chun was in it. She was 34 years old, and she had the fine-boned structure of a woman who had always been slight and who had been made slighter by the hours in this chair. Her shoulders compressed forward, her hands zip-tied behind the chair's back rail. Her coat was still on. Her canvas shopping bag was on the floor 6 feet away, overturned. Its contents, a wallet, a phone with a cracked screen, a child's hair tie in pink, a small notebook, scattered across the concrete. She was conscious. Her eyes came to the door the moment it opened, and what moved across her face was not relief, not yet, not immediately, but a rapid, terrified calculation, because she didn't know who was coming through that door, and the last hours had taught her that the arrival of new people was not a neutral event. Then she saw Boone. She didn't know him, had never seen him in her life. He was a large man in a leather cut with a road-worn face and a scar along his jaw, and he was exactly the kind of person that her immediate context, zip ties, warehouse, work lights in the dark, would suggest was more threat than rescue. But he looked at her and said, clearly and without drama, "Sarah Chun, your daughter sent us." He hadn't planned that sentence. It arrived fully formed from some instinct about what she needed to hear first, and it was the right sentence because he watched it land in her face and saw the calculation shift. There were 2 other men in the warehouse. The first was standing near a folding table that had been set up to Sarah's left, a table with documents on it, stacked paper, a pen laid across the top. He was mid-40s, heavy-set in the way of a man who had been fit and stopped being fit, but retained the structural mass, dressed in a gray suit that had been good once. He had the face of someone accustomed to rooms being arranged to his benefit, and the expression currently on that face was the expression of a man for whom this had just stopped being true. Victor Hale. Boone recognized the type immediately. Not from research, from pattern. He'd known men like Hale since he was 19 years old, men who used controlled spaces, controlled documents, and the implicit threat of systems they'd partially corrupted to accomplish what direct intimidation couldn't, and who kept enough distance between themselves and the rough work to maintain the fiction of clean hands. The second man was in the far corner of the lit area, half in shadow. He was wearing a deputy's uniform. His hand was at his hip, not on the weapon, near it. The body language of a man who hadn't decided yet and was keeping the option present. Marcus Teal was around Boone's age, maybe a year or 2 older. He had a deputy's build, broad through the middle, the kind of physical mass that a uniform in a department will maintain in a man who stops being careful about it. His face was doing complicated things. He'd clearly been in this building for reasons he'd understood, and those reasons were now being rapidly renegotiated by the presence of 6 men in leather cuts who had just walked through his door. 6. Because by the time Boone had the room fully scanned, Rook and Ghost were flanking inside the door. Cypher was moving to the right wall and already had his tablet out, and Sal had come in behind and was already crossing toward Sarah Chun with his eyes on her hands and her posture and her face in the professional assessment of a man taking a medical reading. Bull would be outside, all exits covered. Hale spoke first. "This is private property and you are trespassing," he said. His voice was steady. Rehearsed steady, Anand. The kind of steady that takes effort to produce and so has a slightly compressed quality, as if the words were being pressed through a narrower opening than normal. "I want you out of this building immediately." Boone looked at him. He didn't respond. He walked to the folding table and looked at the documents on it. He didn't touch them. He looked at them, reading the header of the top sheet from standing height. It was a loan restructuring agreement, the kind with dense paragraphs and an extended signature section at the bottom. "How much?" Boone said. "I beg your pardon? How much is she signing for?" Hale's jaw shifted. "That is a private financial matter between this company and—" "How much, Victor?" The use of his first name landed differently than Victor Hale had expected, and the slight widening of his eyes was the tell. From the chair, Sarah said, in a voice that was quiet and hoarse, 62,000. Boone looked at her. She was looking at the document, not at Hale, at the paper. "They said the original amount compounded," she said. "With the penalty rate and the legal fees, they said if I didn't sign tonight, they'd file in county court and I'd lose the apartment." She paused. "Lily and I would lose the apartment." There it was. $62,000, arrived at through the alchemy of predatory lending, a number that bore no proportional relationship to anything Sarah Chun had actually borrowed, assembled instead from a spreadsheet of compounding rates and buried penalties and fictitious legal fees, designed specifically to be large enough to be paralyzing and small enough to remain theoretically defensible in a courtroom where the judge had never sat in Sarah Chun's kitchen and done the math on what $62,000 meant on a salary of 31. Sal had reached Sarah and was crouching behind the chair, doing something quiet and careful with the zip ties. He had a small tool in his hand. He worked without looking at Hale or Teal, just at his hands and her wrists. Teal said, "You need to stop." Sal didn't stop. "Sir?" Teal's hand moved an inch closer to the holster. "I'm a sworn officer of Harmon County, and I'm ordering you to step away from a—" "She's injured," Sal said, without looking up, in the voice of someone reading a temperature off a gauge. "Circulation impairment in both hands. This is a medical intervention." "I don't care, Deputy Teal." Boone had turned from the table and was looking at Teal now with the same quality of attention he'd given Lily on the steps. Full, direct, level, unhurried. "You're not here on county business. You didn't log this location. You drove a county vehicle to a location where a woman is being held against her will and coerced into signing a fraudulent document." He let that sit for a moment. "Whatever Victor Hale told you tonight was worth, I want you to think about what you're doing right now and calculate whether you want to add obstruction to the list." Teal's jaw worked. "I don't know who you people are," he said. "We're people who found a 6-year-old alone on a sidewalk," Boone said. "That's the whole story." Something moved in Teal's face. Something shifted in the hard-pressed certainty of his expression. It wasn't remorse. Not yet, and maybe not ever, depending on the kind of man he turned out to be. But it was a fracture. A recognition that the architecture of the evening had changed in a way he hadn't authorized. Hale said, "Marcus, do your job." Teal looked at Hale. Then he looked at Boone. Then he looked at the tablet in Cypher's hands, which Cypher had angled just enough to be visible. Not to show Teal what was on it, but to let him see that something was on it, that keystrokes were happening, that whatever was going to happen next was not going to be contained in this building by anything Teal did or didn't do with his hand near his holster. The zip tie came free. Sarah made a sound, not loud, just a sharp exhaled breath as circulation returned to her hands. The particular involuntary gasp of pain that comes with restored blood flow. She brought her hands to her front and held them together against her sternum, pressing them flat the way you do when something hurts in the hands, and you don't have a better option. Sal put his hand on her shoulder. "Can you stand?" "Yes," she said immediately. Then she tried. It was harder than the word had indicated. 3 hours in a metal folding chair with your hands behind you does things to the hips and lower back that aren't visible until you ask the body to do what it's designed to do. She made it upright with Sal's hand at her elbow and stood with the slightly unsteady quality of someone who was compensating and intended to keep compensating until compensating was no longer required. She looked at Boone. "Where's Lily?" she said. "Safe," Boone said. "Supermarket. 2 of our guys are with her. She's okay." Sarah Chun's face did something that it probably hadn't been allowed to do in 3 hours. It came apart slightly at the edges. Not into sobbing, she didn't have the structural stability left for that, but into the expression of a woman who has been holding something at sufficient internal pressure to fracture concrete and has just been told she can set it down. She pressed both hands harder against her sternum and breathed. Hale said, "You have no legal right to—" "Victor." Boone's voice had shifted just slightly. "Stop talking." Hale stopped. The room had reorganized itself around a new geometry, and Hale was experienced enough to understand what that reorganization meant, even if he hadn't accepted it emotionally yet. Cypher said, from the right wall, "Sent." Boone looked at him. "Full package," Cypher said. "Columbus field office. Financial records, the footage, the Teal payment records. Location, current timestamp." He lowered the tablet. "They'll have it in the next 11 minutes. The agent I sent it to is—" he chose his words carefully— "someone who has been waiting for something attachable to Hale's operation for a while." Hale's face changed. It was a specific change. The kind that happened in a face when a man's internal model of how a situation was going to resolve was suddenly voided and replaced with a new model that he didn't prefer. His mouth tightened. His eyes moved to Teal. Teal was not looking back. Teal was looking at the floor. And that, Boone thought, was the answer to the question of what kind of man Marcus Teal was going to turn out to be. Not the worst kind. Not the kind who doubled down in the face of collapse. The kind who'd gone along for reasons of money and convenience and hadn't thought past the individual transactions to the eventual arithmetic of all of them added together. A man who was now doing that arithmetic in real time in a warehouse in the Kellerman Industrial Park and arriving at a number he didn't like. Rook said from the door, "Boone." Something in his voice made Boone turn. Rook was looking at his phone. His expression had changed. It had gone to a specific place that Boone recognized and didn't like recognizing. The place Rook's face went when something had gotten worse in a direction that was going to require a decision. "What?" Boone said. "Dex just messaged." He turned the phone. "Someone called the police to the supermarket." "Not the police we called. Someone made a separate call. Said there was a gang-related disturbance and a child in danger." The air in the warehouse was very still. "They've got 2 units at the store," Rook said. "Dex says they're questioning him about Lily, about who he is, why he's with her, where her parents are." He paused. "One of the officers is saying they need to contact Child Protective Services to take Lily into custody pending location of a guardian." Sarah made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a woman who had just been told that the distance between herself and her daughter had been measured incorrectly and was actually longer than she'd understood. Boone looked at her. Then he looked at Rook. Then he looked at Hale. And something settled in his face that was not quite anger and not quite cold calculation, but existed in the geographic space between them. The expression of a man who had just had the specific terrain of the next hours clarified against his wishes and had decided to operate in it anyway. "Ghost," he said. "Yeah." "Stay with Sarah and Sal. Get her to the bikes." "And them?" Ghost looked at Hale and Teal. Boone thought about it for exactly the time it deserved, which was not very long. "Teal's armed," he said. "We don't touch that situation." He looked at the deputy. "You're going to stay here. You're going to think about what the FBI package looks like when they open it in Columbus. And then you're going to make whatever decision you're going to make." He held Teal's gaze. "I'd recommend making it in the direction of cooperation." Teal said nothing. Boone looked at Hale. "Victor," he said, "those documents on the table, they're not getting signed. The money Sarah Chun does not owe you, all of it, every compounded cent, you are going to make a choice about whether you want to contest that in a federal venue or resolve it quietly. I'd recommend the same direction I recommended to the deputy." Hale said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Boone looked at him for a long moment. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Boone said. "A man who built 11 years of a business model on the specific calculation that the people he was extracting money from didn't have the resources to fight him. He picked up the documents from the table, the full stack, and rolled them lengthwise. The model broke tonight. He dropped the rolled documents on the warehouse floor. Then he turned and followed Ghost and Sal and Sarah toward the door. Rook was last out. At the door, he paused and looked back at the room. Hale at the table, Teal against the far wall, the two work lights burning in the empty center of the space, the metal folding chair where Sarah Chun had been sitting. Rook looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he walked out. Outside, the cold was immediate and total. Sarah came out of the building and the cold hit her, and she stopped for a moment and just breathed it. The open air, the dark sky, the fog on the fields, the specific relief of outside after inside, of uncontrolled space after a metal folding chair. Sal kept his hand at her elbow. They moved to the bikes. At the gate, Sarah stopped. "I need to get to her," she said. Not a request, a statement of physics, the kind of sentence that describes a law rather than a preference. "We know," Ghost said. "My car is—" She stopped. She looked around. She didn't have a car here. She'd been brought in someone else's car. "I don't have—" "You ride with me," Boone said. He said it the way you say things when the logistics are simple and the time is short and the alternatives are irrelevant. Sarah looked at the motorcycle. At Boone. She had not been on a motorcycle in her life. "You'll hold on to me," Boone said. "That's the whole job. Can you do that?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. They got on. The engine started. 5 of them, because Bull had come around from the far side of the building and was already at his machine. 6 bikes, 1 extra rider, and the fog, and the darkened Route 9 west, back toward the flickering neon of the Harmon Square supermarket, where a 6-year-old girl was being told by a police officer that she needed to come with them. They had 6 minutes. Boone rolled to the gate and through it and onto the access road. And behind him he could feel Sarah Chun's arms locked around his torso with the grip of someone who had decided that if holding on was the only thing she could control in the next 6 minutes, she was going to hold on with everything she had. He opened the throttle. The bikes hit Route 9, and the cold air became a wall, and the fog split, and the lights of the town appeared in the distance like scattered embers, and Boone was already doing the calculation. The units at the supermarket, the timing, what Dex had or hadn't been able to communicate, whether the responding officers were the kind who could be reasoned with, or the kind who'd made a decision before they arrived and were working backward from it. He was doing this calculation when Cypher's voice came through the earpiece with something in it that made the calculation stop. "Boone," Cypher said. "What?" "The FBI contact in Columbus called back, faster than I expected." A pause. "He says the Hale file isn't new to them. They've had an open investigation on Pinnacle Capital for 14 months. Another pause. Longer. "But he said something else. He said when I mentioned your name, your actual name, so he went quiet. And then he asked me if you knew that the undercover agent embedded in Hale's operation for the last 8 months is someone you know. The road ahead, the fog, the lights of Carver Falls. He said," Cypher continued, and the quality of his voice had shifted into something careful, "that the agent's name is Daniel Mercer." The bike held its line. Boone's hands did not move on the grips. But something happened in the space behind his sternum where the weight lived. A sudden shift. A sudden terrible recalibration, like a load that had been balanced for a long time, being moved 1 degree past center. Daniel Mercer. His brother. His brother, who he had not spoken to in 11 years. Who he had been told, who he had been led to believe. The lights of the supermarket neon appeared ahead. Flickering S half dead. And somewhere in the building behind them, Victor Hale was reaching for his phone with the specific urgency of a man who had just watched his leverage walk out a warehouse door, and dialing a number that would trigger a contingency he'd built for exactly this kind of... The supermarket parking lot came up fast. Boone had the throttle open on the last quarter mile, and the cold hit him like a physical argument. The kind of cold that found every seam in his jacket and pressed in, that made his eyes water behind the visor and dried his throat to felt. He didn't close the throttle. He felt Sarah's arms tighten around him as the speed held, and the lights of the Harmon Square sign grew from embers to something readable, the broken neon H dark, the S still doing its 4-second pulse like a wounded signal. 2 cruisers in the lot. Light bars running. Not emergency, just the passive rotation, the kind that established presence rather than urgency. Both cars angled in front of the entrance. One officer standing outside the sliding doors, hands on belt. Through the glass, the store interior was visible, and Boone could see a cluster of people near the customer service area, and he could see Dex's gray beard and the wire-rimmed glasses, and beside him, a small figure in a pink jacket. Lily was still there. He pulled in and cut the engine and had the kickstand down before the bike fully stopped moving. Sarah was off before he could say anything. She was on the ground and moving toward the entrance with a velocity that had nothing mechanical in it, just pure propulsion from a source that had been compressed for 3 hours and was releasing now without permission. The officer at the door stepped forward. "Ma'am." "That's my daughter," Sarah said. Not loudly. Louder than she needed to. She went through the sliding doors. Boone was right behind her, but he stopped at the entrance. He stopped because the officer, young, maybe 26, the particular stance of someone on shift who'd been handed a situation by dispatch without full context, had turned from Sarah toward Boone, and there was a specific recalibration happening in his face. "Sir," the officer said. "Officer," Boone said. They looked at each other. Inside, Lily saw her mother. The sound she made was not words. It was the sound of a child whose body had been running on the reserve fuel of waiting, and the waiting had just ended, and the reserve had run out simultaneously with the reason for it, and the resulting sound was something between a word and a sob and a name, Mom, compressed into a single syllable that carried the entire weight of 3 hours alone on a cold concrete step. They collided near the customer service desk. Sarah went to her knees on the supermarket floor and took Lily against her chest with both arms, and held her with the kind of grip that wasn't about comfort so much as verification. The physical confirmation that the child was present, unharmed, real, here. Lily's pink jacket bunched up under her mother's hands. The purple backpack hit the floor. Dex stood 2 feet back, hands in his pockets, looking at the ceiling with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not fully succeeding. The second officer, older, inside, the one who'd apparently been leading the situation, looked at the reunion for a moment. He had a notepad out. He clicked his pen twice. He looked at Dex. Dex looked back at him. "Mother's been located," Dex said, "as we told you she would be." The officer clicked his pen again, did not write anything. Outside, Boone had the young officer's attention and was providing, briefly and without editorial, a description of what had occurred at the Kellerman warehouse and what had already been transmitted to the FBI field office in Columbus. He used the officer's name. He'd gotten it from the nameplate before he started talking, a habit, and spoken the direct organized register of a man who had written after-action reports and understood what made them usable. Facts, sequence, names, times. The officer listened. Then he listened some more. Then he said, "You're saying there's a deputy out there right now? Teal?" "Unit 14, Boone said. "Yes." The officer looked at his cruiser, then at his radio, then back at Boone with the expression of a man whose Tuesday had just become something that was going to require significantly more paperwork than he'd budgeted for. The other bikers had pulled in and parked. They stood near the machines in the cold, Bull and Ghost and Cypher and Rook, spread out loosely in the way they spread when a situation was in transition and nobody knew yet which direction it would settle. Sal was still inside with Sarah and Lily. Cypher had his tablet in his hands. He had not put it away once since the warehouse. Boone came back to the group after 2 minutes with the officer. He looked at Cypher. "The Columbus contact," Boone said. "What exactly did he tell you?" Cypher didn't answer immediately. He was doing something on the tablet. His jaw was tight in a way that Boone had learned to read. Not concentration, something else. "Cypher. I heard you." He lowered the tablet. "Daniel Mercer, 8 months embedded in Hale's operation. The agent running him at Columbus said the embed began 14 months ago, the same time the investigation opened. But Daniel didn't get inside Hale's inner circle until about 8 months in." He paused. "The agent said they've been building toward a federal arrest of Hale for 6 months. They were 2 weeks from having enough." Boone said nothing. Rook said, catching the tense. "The agent said when I transmitted the package tonight, The warehouse location, the footage, the financial records. It accelerated the timeline, which should be good. Cypher looked at Boone. But he said there's a problem. Daniel's cover identity is attached to a man named Cole Briggs, goes by Cole, works as a logistics coordinator for one of Hale's shell companies. He stopped. Briggs, Rook said. The assistant manager at the store. Terrence Briggs. His brother, Cypher said. The parking lot felt smaller suddenly. The cold pressed in from a different direction. Daniel's cover is built around being connected to Terrence Briggs, Cypher continued. That's how he got in. Terrence has been running the store as a recruitment point for Hale's operation, identifying people in financial trouble, flagging them to Hale's people. Sarah Chun was flagged 3 months ago. He glanced at Boone. Terrence doesn't know Cole Briggs is FBI. But when those two men walked Sarah out the rear exit tonight, that was a sanctioned action within Hale's operation, which means Daniel knew it was coming. Boone's voice came out very level. What do you mean he knew? Oh, the agent said the operation has a protocol. When a debtor gets escalated, moved from document pressure to physical collection, Daniel gets notified through his cover roll. He's supposed to process the paperwork on the back end. Cypher looked at him steadily. The agent said Daniel filed a notice with the FBI handler 4 hours ago saying the escalation was happening. Tonight. Harmon Square Supermarket. The neon sign pulsed. The cold moved. He filed the notice, Boone said. Yes. And the agent said the operational decision was to let it proceed, to not intervene, because intervening tonight would have burned Daniel's cover 3 weeks before they had enough for a federal arrest. Cypher's voice was carefully absent of judgment. The calculus was that Sarah Chun would be held for a few hours, sign under duress, and be released, that the evidence from the signing under duress would be part of the federal case, that burning Daniel's cover to stop it wasn't worth. Lily was on that step for 3 hours, Boone said. Yes. Because Daniel filed a notice and sat on it. Cypher said nothing. The parking lot held the silence for a moment. Then Rook said, he let a child sit on a sidewalk alone for 3 hours because it was inconvenient for his case. Rook, Boone said. I'm not wrong. No, Boone said. You're not. He looked away toward the road. But right now it doesn't matter. It matters to me. It matters to me too. The sharpness in it was controlled, blade width. But right now Daniel is embedded in Hale's inner circle, and Hale just watched his entire operation walk out of a warehouse on our backs, and Hale is not a patient man. Whatever Daniel's position is inside that circle right now, Cypher said, that's the problem. He turned the tablet. On the screen was a message, encrypted, the kind that came through a specific channel that had nothing to do with standard messaging apps, the kind that Cypher had maintained from a previous life, and that had, on perhaps 4 occasions in the years since, proven its value. The message was 3 lines. Cole Briggs not responding. Last contact 2204, position unknown. Hale activated contingency protocol at 2217. Do not approach. Federal operational assets mobilizing. ETA 90 minutes. The timestamp on the message was 2231. It was currently 2244. 90 minutes minus 13 was 77 minutes. Daniel had gone dark 22 minutes ago, 6 minutes after the warehouse doors had opened and everything had changed. Boone read the message twice. He stood very still. He was doing the calculation that nobody else in the group was in a position to do, because nobody else knew the specific geography of what Daniel Mercer being in danger meant to Boone Mercer, the specific weight of 11 years of silence, and a story that had been told to him about his brother that had apparently been told wrong, or told with deliberate incompleteness, and which Boone had spent 11 years carrying as a completed fact rather than a still open question. He handed the tablet back to Cypher. What's Hale's contingency? Boone said. I don't know the specific protocol. Best read. Cypher thought about it without performing thinking. Hale's been operating in Harmon County for 11 years with a layer of law enforcement protection. That protection just cracked publicly. Teal is sitting in a warehouse knowing federal eyes are on him. Hale's operation is compromised. His first instinct is going to be to close open variables. He looked at Boone. Daniel is an open variable. Cole Briggs has been inside the inner circle for 8 months. He knows faces, accounts, locations, structures. From Hale's perspective, the moment the warehouse situation collapsed, every person close to him became either an asset or a liability. He paused. Cole Briggs becomes a liability, Rook said quietly. Where would Hale take him? Somewhere he controls. Somewhere he can work without interruption for the window he has before the federal response arrives. Cypher turned back to the tablet. Hale owns property in Harmon County under 3 different corporate structures. I've been mapping them. He pulled up a list. Most of them are commercial, office space, a storage facility, the warehouse we just left. But there's one that's residential, a property on Crane Lake Road registered to a family trust. It's a lake house, private access, 17 acres. He looked at the map. It's 9 minutes from here. 9 minutes. 77 until federal assets arrived. 68 minutes of no margin. Boone turned to the supermarket entrance. Through the glass, he could see Sal kneeling in front of Lily, speaking to her at her level the way medics learn to speak to people when they're trying to make them feel present and accounted for. Sarah was standing beside them with her hand on Lily's head, and her face was the face of a woman who had used everything she had and was running on something below the line of reserve. Boone went inside. He walked to Sarah. She looked up at him, and he could see the exhaustion in her, the specific quality of it, not the tiredness of a long day, but the aftermath of sustained fear, which is a different kind of depletion, cellular rather than muscular, the kind that doesn't resolve with sleep. You're safe, Boone said. The police are here. Cypher has transmitted everything to federal investigators, and they're mobilizing. You and Lily stay with Sal and Dex tonight. He paused. Do you have someone you can call? Family? A friend? Someone you trust? Sarah looked at him. My sister, she said. In Dayton. Call her. Stay somewhere other than your apartment tonight. Not because you're in danger. You're not. It's over for you. But because it'll be easier if you're not there when the federal paperwork starts. He looked at Lily. She should sleep in a real bed tonight. Lily was looking up at him with those dark, serious eyes. Are you leaving? She said. Boone crouched. We've got something we need to finish, he said. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Is it dangerous? Little bit, Boone said. She accepted this with the solemnity of a child who had been told the truth enough tonight to recognize it on contact. Then she reached forward and put both her small hands around one of his. A gesture that wasn't a hug and wasn't a handshake, just a specific grip, a holding, the way you hold something you're about to have to let go of. Be careful, she said. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I will. Outside, he straightened and walked to the bikes and looked at his men. Crane Lake Road, he said. 9 minutes. Nobody asked why. They'd been close enough to the conversation with Cypher to have the shape of it. Rook said, This is a federal operation. Yes. We're not federal. No. If Daniel Mercer is the reason Sarah Chun sat on a sidewalk for 3 hours. He's also my brother, Boone said. The parking lot was very quiet. The neon sign pulsed. Rook looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not the short-fuse anger, something slower and deeper. Something that was trying to calibrate between what he thought and what the man he trusted thought, and finding the distance between them larger than he'd expected. You didn't know, Rook said. Not a question. No. How long has he been? I don't know. I didn't know he was alive. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you state a fact that has been relocated from the category of certainty into the category of something else. I was told 11 years ago that he was dead. I believed it. I buried it. He looked at the road. I was wrong to believe it, or someone was wrong to tell me, and I don't know yet which one it is. Ghost said from somewhere behind him, It matters which. Yes, Boone said. It does. And I intend to ask him. He put his helmet on. But I can only ask him if he's alive in 66 minutes when the federal response arrives. So we're going to Crane Lake Road, and we're going to make sure that's still an option. He started the bike. The others started theirs. 6 engines, 9 minutes, a lake road in the October dark. He did not think about Daniel on the ride. He willed himself not to. He thought instead about the road surface, the fog visibility, the 9-minute math, The property layout Cypher had pulled up in the 30 seconds before they'd left the lot. Long private driveway, single structure, lake at the rear, no neighboring properties within a quarter mile. He thought about entry vectors and sight lines and the specific problem of approaching a property at night where a man with nothing left to lose might be waiting. He did not think about Daniel at 19, skinny and dark-eyed and too smart for the town they'd both grown up in. He did not think about the last conversation they'd had, the argument, the specific words, the door that had closed in a way that had felt permanent even at the time. He did not think about the phone call 11 years ago, the voice on the other end, the words that had reorganized everything. He did not think about any of it. The fog thickened on Crane Lake Road. The trees came close on both sides, mature hardwoods, the kind that had been growing since before either of the Mercer brothers was born, their canopies meeting overhead and cutting the ambient light to almost nothing. The headlights pressed a narrow tunnel through the dark, and the wet leaves on the road surface reflected them back in pieces. The driveway entrance was a break in the tree line on the left, gated with a wooden beam gate, the rural kind, hinged at one post, meant to discourage casual trespass rather than enforce serious security. The gate was open. Boone stopped the bike at the entrance and cut the engine. The others stopped and cut theirs. In the silence, through the trees and down the driveway, light was visible from a building. Multiple light sources, not just habitation light, too much for that, the kind of light that meant people were working in a space. And a sound. Faint, at the edge of audible, but present. A voice, male, steady, the quality of a man speaking with the controlled patience of someone explaining terms. Boone looked at Ghost. Ghost was already off his bike. He moved into the tree line and disappeared. The rest of them waited. The cold came off the lake from the far side of the property on. A different cold than the road, wetter, heavier, carrying the mineral smell of still water. Somewhere in the trees an animal moved in the underbrush. Nobody spoke. Rook came up beside Boone. Close, voice below a breath. "If it goes wrong in there," Rook said. "It won't." Boone, "If it goes wrong and we have to make a hard call to get your brother out." "It won't." Rook was quiet for a moment. Then, "You haven't seen him in 11 years. You thought he was dead. Whatever happened in there, whatever Daniel Mercer has or hasn't done in the last 8 months, in the last 11 years, you don't know him anymore." He paused. "I need you to know that I'm telling you this because you're the smartest man I've ever ridden with, and the thing that can make smart men stupid is blood." Boone turned and looked at him. In the dark, on a wet lake road in October, with fog coming off the water and Hale's lights visible through the trees and 61 minutes until federal assets arrived, Boone Mercer looked at Danny Ferris, who had been Rook for 9 years but who had a name and a history and a specific kind of loyalty that was not the easy kind, not the kind that simply agreed, and said nothing for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "I know. Okay. But I'm still going in." Ghost materialized from the tree line. "3 people inside," he said. "Hale, 1 man I don't recognize, and—" He looked at Boone. "3rd person zip-tied to a chair." He paused. "He's been hit. I could see it from the window. Face." Boone breathed in. "Conscious?" Sal from behind. "Moving," Ghost said. "Barely." Boone looked at the driveway. 60 minutes. He needed Daniel alive and conscious and functional for 60 minutes, at which point federal assets would be on this property, and the 11-year question would either be answerable or it wouldn't. He needed 60 minutes, and he had 6 men in the cold and the dark and the fog off the lake. And Victor Hale inside that house doing what men like Victor Hale did when they understood the walls were closing and decided that the last thing they could control was the variable that could. The driveway was 60 yards of wet gravel, an old oak canopy, and the kind of dark that pressed against the edges of your peripheral vision, like something physical. Boone went in first. Not on the bike. On foot, moving along the right edge of the driveway where the gravel gave way to wet grass and dead leaves, and the footfall was quieter. Ghost was already somewhere to the left, absorbed into the tree line the way Ghost absorbed into things, without announcement, without trace. Rook was 3 paces behind Boone. Behind Rook came Bull, who moved through darkness with a specific kind of competence that had nothing to do with stealth training and everything to do with a man who had spent 11 years working a corrections facility on the overnight shift and had learned that the dark was simply another room. Cypher stayed at the driveway entrance. He'd pulled position behind a mature oak with the tablet open, running the federal contact channel and the local scanner simultaneously, tracking the countdown. Sal staged 20 yards up the driveway, kit open, the controlled readiness of a man who'd done this before. Not this specific thing, but the category of it. The version where someone was coming out of a building hurt, and the next 5 minutes would matter. 58 minutes until federal response. The house resolved from the dark as they moved up the driveway. A lake property from the 80s, wood frame, 2 stories, the kind of place that had been expensive once and had been maintained at a level that communicated continued investment. Covered porch across the front. Attached garage to the right, its door closed. The light they'd seen from the road was coming from the ground floor interior, visible through 2 large windows facing the driveway. Warm, multiple sources. The kind of illumination that came from standing work lights rather than domestic fixtures. The same setup as the warehouse. Hale was a man of repeated methods. Boone stopped at the edge of the porch shadow and looked at the near window. The angle gave him partial interior, a section of floor, the edge of a table, the lower half of a man standing, and across the room, partly obscured by the window frame, a figure in a chair. The figure was slumped to the right at an angle that wasn't comfortable. Not unconscious, but there was movement, the slight resistance of a person maintaining some posture against gravity, but diminished, taxed. He looked for the second man Ghost had reported and couldn't place him from this angle. He touched the earpiece. 1 click. Ghost's return click came back immediately. He was in position. 2 clicks meant the secondary entrance, the rear door that faced the lake, was viable. Boone looked at Rook. Rook looked at the front door. Together, Boone said, under his breath. Rook nodded once. They went up the porch steps. 4 of them, old wood, and the second one from the top had a soft spot that compressed slightly under Boone's weight, without full creak, the kind of thing you only noticed if you were moving with deliberate care. He stepped to its edge. The porch boards themselves were tighter, better maintained. He looked through the window from the near edge of the frame. Full view now. Victor Hale was standing at the center of the room near the folding table. A different table from the warehouse. The folding table from the garage probably, carried in, a familiar prop in a familiar arrangement. He was still in the gray suit. The tie was gone now, and the top button of the dress shirt was open, and the controlled presentation of the man in the warehouse had frayed at the edges in a way that made him simultaneously less polished and more dangerous. The second man was near the rear wall, mid-30s, shaved head, the kind of physical build that read as professional in a specific sense, the sense that suggested employment history rather than personal motivation. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his weight distributed in the posture of someone maintaining readiness without performing it. He was holding a phone. His attention was split between the phone and the man in the chair. The man in the chair was Daniel Mercer. Boone had not seen his brother in 11 years, and the face in the chair was the face of a man in his late 30s who looked like the person Boone remembered the way a photograph taken in hard weather looks like the original photograph. Recognizable in structure, altered by accumulation. Daniel was lean in a way Boone wasn't, always had been, but the leanness now had the quality of something that had been tested. His face, even through the window, showed the specific geography of a man who'd been hit. The left eye swollen to a narrow aperture, a cut along the brow that had bled and dried, the jaw held at the careful angle of someone managing pain by not moving the thing that hurts. His hands were zip-tied to the chair arms. His eyes were open. Hale was speaking to him. Boone couldn't hear the words through the glass, but he could read the body language. Hale, standing over Daniel with the patient, pressured delivery of a man who had asked a question multiple times and was on the last version of his patience. Daniel's head was tilted slightly up, looking at Hale with the expression of someone who had decided on a response and was maintaining it under conditions designed to change it, not giving him anything. Boone took 1 breath, held it, let it out. Then he tried the door. It was unlocked. Later, he would think about that. The unlocked door on a property where a man was conducting exactly the kind of business that should have every access point secured. He would think about it, and arrive at the explanation that Hale was a man who operated through structure and leverage and intermediaries and had never been personally in a room when things went wrong, and so had never developed the reflexive security habits of a man who had. The door was unlocked because Hale had assumed the locked gate was sufficient. The gate at the warehouse had been sufficient too, until it wasn't. The door opened. Boone walked through it. Hale turned. The man with the phone turned faster. He was better trained, his reaction time shorter, and his right hand moved to his jacket. Bull came through the door behind Boone, and the geometry of the room changed. Bull was 6'1" and 240 pounds, and he moved with the specific, unhurried purpose of a man who had spent 11 years standing between people and the worst versions of their intentions. And when he crossed the room to the man with the phone, he did it in 3 steps, and the man with the phone made a decision that was the correct decision, which was to stop moving his hand toward the jacket and to stand very still instead. Bull took the phone. He took it the way you take something from someone when taking it is the statement, and there doesn't need to be a conversation about it. Hale said, "You were at the warehouse." "Yes," Boone said. "This is private property," Boone said. "I know. You said that last time too." He walked past Hale to the chair. He crouched in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at him, one eye mostly open, one eye mostly not. The recognition was immediate. It moved across Daniel's face in the specific way of recognition that has been carried for a long time and has been certain it would arrive in a different context than this one. "Hey," Daniel said. His voice was thick on one side, the jaw thing. "Hey," Boone said. There was 11 years of silence in the 2 syllables, and neither of them had the capacity to address it right now, and both of them knew it. "Can you walk?" Boone said. "Yeah." "You sure?" "I said yeah." Boone looked at the zip ties. He reached back without looking, and Rook, who had materialized behind him, put a knife handle in his palm. He cut the left tie, then the right. Daniel brought his hands forward and held them together the same way Sarah had, pressed against his sternum, managing the circulation return. His wrists had the redness of someone who'd been pulling against the restraints. Daniel started. "I know," Boone said. "Cypher already sent it. The federal response is—" He checked the time without looking at his watch, an internal calculation. 55 minutes out. Daniel looked at him. "You've been busy," he said. 6-year-old was sitting alone on a sidewalk, Boone said. "That's the whole story." Something moved in Daniel's face at that. Not guilt exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that had been residing in the area of his expression that the injury hadn't reached, in the functional eye, in the set of his mouth. He didn't say anything. Boone stood. He turned to Hale. Victor Hale had not moved from the center of the room. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and his expression had undergone the same shift Boone had seen in the warehouse, the model of the evening collapsing and being replaced by something he hadn't planned for. But there was something different about it now. In the warehouse, the collapse had been clean. A man reading the room and adjusting. This wasn't that. There was something in Hale's face that was outside the register of adjustment, something that had crossed from calculation into a space beyond it. "You don't understand what you've done," Hale said. Boone looked at him. "The federal investigation," Hale said. "What your man transmitted tonight, the financial records, the payment records. Do you understand what that's going to surface?" His voice was still controlled. That was the specific quality of it that was wrong. A man whose operation had just collapsed should sound like a man whose operation had just collapsed. Hale sounded like a man making an argument. There are people attached to Pinnacle Capital Solutions who are not Victor Hale. There are people whose names are in those records who are in positions where those names cannot be in federal records. Then they should have thought about that before, Rook said. You don't know who they are. Don't need to, Rook said. Hale looked at Boone, not at Rook. At Boone, with the specific targeting of a man who had identified the decision-maker in a room and was addressing that person. There will be a response to what happened tonight, Hale said. Not from me. I'm finished. I understand that. But from the people whose names are in those records, people who have resources and reach and no interest in federal exposure. He paused. They will identify who transmitted the package. They will work backward from the investigation to everyone involved. That is not a threat. That is a description of how these people operate. The room was quiet. Sal had come through the door and was crouching beside Daniel, doing a rapid medical assessment. The eye, the jaw, the wrists, working his way through with the practiced efficiency of someone who had stopped asking permission to do this years ago. Boone looked at Hale for a long moment. "What are their names?" Boone said. Hale looked at him. "You just said they're in the records," Boone said. "But Cypher pulled those records from buried vendor databases. He may not have caught every layer, so I'm asking you directly. What are their names?" Hale was quiet. "Victor," Boone said. "You're done. Your operation is done, Teal is done, the shell companies are done. The only variable you can control from here is what you choose to say in the next 10 minutes and who you choose to say it to." He paused. "Federal investigators are 53 minutes away. Anything you tell me, I'll make sure reaches them with your cooperation on record." Hale looked at Daniel. Daniel, from the chair with Sal's hand at his jaw doing a pressure assessment, said, "Tell him, Victor." Something passed between Hale and Daniel that Boone didn't have the context to fully read. 8 months of proximity, 8 months of a relationship built on false architecture and real proximity, the specific complicated scar tissue of an undercover operation. Whatever it was, it shifted something in Hale's face. He said a name, then another. Boone didn't react visibly. He filed them. The man with the phone, Hale's man, the one Bull was standing next to with the specific quality of a wall, said, "Victor, stop." Hale looked at him. "Victor, those names are already in the federal records," Hale said, "as of 2 hours ago." The man's jaw worked. "Sit down," Bull said. It wasn't loud. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed in enclosed spaces. The man sat. Cypher's voice in the earpiece. "Boone." Boone touched the piece. "Yeah." "The Columbus contact called back. The names you're about to give me. I think I'm going to recognize them." "Probably." "The investigation is going to get bigger than Hale." "That's what Hale just told me." A pause. 49 minutes. Ghost appeared from somewhere toward the back of the house. He'd come through the lake door, had done his circuit of the interior, and materialized in the room the way he always did. He looked at Boone and shook his head once. No one else in the building. Boone looked at Daniel. Daniel had gotten himself partially upright from the chair, assisted by Sal. He was standing with one hand on the chair back, redistributing weight, testing the body's report. The testing expression was controlled, the way it was controlled when the report was not fully positive, but the alternative to standing was worse. "The contingency," Boone said to him. Daniel looked at him. Hale said he activated a contingency protocol, after the warehouse, whatever that means in his operation. Daniel's expression did something complicated. "It means he signaled the names he just gave you," Daniel said. "That their arrangement with Pinnacle was exposed. That they should initiate their own containment protocols." He paused. "One of those men has a federal judgeship. One of them sits on the Harmon County Oversight Board." He looked at Boone steadily with his one open eye. "Their containment protocol is not going to be cooperative." "What is it going to be?" Daniel said. "They're going to try to kill the investigation before it reaches indictment, and the most efficient way to kill a federal investigation is to—" His phone buzzed. Not Daniel's phone. Cypher, through the earpiece. "Boone, I've got movement on the scanner, county units. 3 of them, called on a private channel, not dispatch. A separate frequency I almost missed. They're converging on 2 locations." Boone said, "What 2 locations?" "Crane Lake Road," Cypher said, and a pause that lasted exactly the wrong length of time. "The Harmon Square supermarket." Boone's chest went cold. "Dex," he said. "I'm trying to reach him," Cypher said. "No answer on the phone. The units are—" Boone could hear him working, the rapid keystrokes. "The units at the supermarket location are running dark. No lights, moving at speed. Dark, no lights. Not responding to a call. Executing one." "Sarah and Lily," Rook said from behind Boone, and his voice had left the register of controlled anger entirely and arrived somewhere simpler and colder. Boone turned to Ghost. "Bikes. Now." Ghost was already moving. Boone looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking back at him with the single functional eye and the damaged jaw and the wrists that still showed the marks of the zip ties. And whatever the 11 years had been, whatever the conversation they needed to have was, whatever the question of the phone call and the told wrong story and the death that had apparently not been a death, all of it was in suspension, held in the specific amber of a situation that would not wait. "Can you ride?" Boone said. "I don't have a bike." "Bull's riding double." Daniel looked at him. "We're going back to the supermarket," Boone said. Something moved in Daniel's face. The complicated thing, the adjacent to guilt thing, but more specific now. Sharpened by context into something that had a name. He said, "Boone." "Later," Boone said. They went through the door. Outside, the night was still and cold, and the fog off the lake had spread further, and the driveway dark pressed in around the bikes as the engines started one by one, their collective sound rising through the oak canopy and out into the October air above Crane Lake Road. 47 minutes. 7 miles back to the supermarket. 3 county units running dark toward 2 separate locations, dispatched on a private channel by men whose names were now in a federal evidence package, but who were not yet in custody, and who had been operating in Harmon County for long enough to know exactly which levers to pull. Boone hit the driveway at speed. The gravel sprayed behind him. He came out of the tree line onto Crane Lake Road and opened the throttle and felt the bike surge forward, the headlight cutting a narrow path through the fog, and behind him he could hear the others, the sequenced roar of 6 engines on a back road at night, coming out of the trees and onto the asphalt, and accelerating in the specific unified way of men who didn't need a signal to know the pace. 7 miles. The scanner in Cypher's earpiece had given him an estimated 3-minute head start on the county units. 3 minutes. He did not think about what 3 minutes meant or didn't mean. He thought about the road. He thought about the fog and the wet asphalt and the corners coming up, and he rode them with the specific quality of intention that was different from speed. The weight transfer, the lean angle, the throttle position through the arc, the physical calculus of a man who had been on motorcycles for 27 years and who understood that the fastest way through a corner was not the thing that felt fastest, but the thing that was. Cypher in the earpiece. "Boone, I reached Dex." "Go." "He's got Sarah and Lily in his car. He saw the units coming dark and he moved. He's driving." "Where?" "He doesn't know. He's just driving," Boone thought. "Tell him Route 9 West," Boone said. "Out of town. We'll intercept. Units will follow." "Yeah," Boone said. "That's the point." The fog pressed in from both sides of the road. The headlight pushed through it in a cone that closed again immediately behind him. Somewhere ahead, the town lights of Carver Falls were beginning to materialize through the murk. Scattered amber and the faint blue-white of street lighting, the specific light signature of a small Ohio town on a Tuesday night. He could see, even at this distance, the glow of the supermarket sign, the broken H, the pulsing S, and 3 sets of headlights, running dark, moving along the near edge of the parking lot. The engines open. The fog split, and Boone Mercer rode toward the lights with 6 machines behind him, and 11 years of unanswered questions riding in the seat behind Bull, and somewhere ahead, a gray-bearded man in wire-rimmed glasses was driving a car with a woman and a 6-year-old through the back streets of Carver Falls, Ohio, trying to stay 1 turn ahead of 3 county units dispatched by men who had decided that the most efficient response to federal exposure was. Dex drove like a man who had learned to drive in places where driving badly had consequences beyond a traffic citation. He'd taken Sarah's hand off the door handle twice already. The second time she'd grabbed it, he'd said, quietly, and without taking his eyes off the road, "I've done this before." And something in the way he said it made her let go. Lily was in the back seat with her seatbelt on and her knees pressed together and her hands flat on her thighs, watching the town move past the window with the expression of a child who had exceeded her daily capacity for frightening things and was now operating on a kind of exhausted autopilot. The wire-rimmed glasses sat slightly crooked on Dex's face. He hadn't adjusted them. He'd seen the county units coming dark before the scanner call from Cypher. Seen them because he'd been a man who noticed things before he'd been a biker, before he'd been the other thing that preceded the biker, and that he didn't discuss in most company. And the specific way those three cars were moving through the parking lot had registered as wrong in the part of his brain that cataloged wrong things automatically and without ceremony. He'd had Sarah and Lily in the car and moving in 90 seconds. Cypher's instruction, Route 9 West, made sense to him immediately. Draw the units out of town, open ground, give Boone's group a position to intercept. He took the westbound ramp at the Route 9 junction and held the car at 60, which was fast enough to maintain separation and slow enough to be followed, and in his rearview mirror the three sets of headlights stayed with him, still dark, which told him everything he needed to know about what kind of units these were. Regular dispatch didn't run dark on a follow. These weren't regular dispatch. Sarah had turned in her seat and was watching the headlights. They're still there. Yes. How many? 3. She turned back to the front. She held her canvas shopping bag on her lap. Someone had retrieved it from the warehouse floor, the contents stuffed back inside, not neatly, just present. And she was pressing both hands flat against it the way she'd been pressing them against her sternum in the warehouse. The same gesture, a different object. What are they going to do? Nothing while we're moving, Dex said. And when we stop. Dex looked in the rear view. We're not going to stop first. The Route 9 westbound stretch opened up past the town limits. Fields on both sides. The fog thicker here because the flat ground gave it nothing to brake against. The headlights behind him maintained distance. Exactly maintained it, which was professional discipline rather than casual following. Then the engines came from behind. Not from behind the following units. From behind Dex's car, further back, coming fast, multiple sources. The specific harmonic of Harley engines running hard on open road. The sound entered the car as vibration before it entered as sound, the way those engines always did. In the rear view, the headlights of the bikes appeared. 7 of them. No, 6, plus one that looked different, a bike running 2 up. They came through the fog like something the road had been keeping in reserve, headlights in a spread formation, and they were moving at a speed that closed the distance between Dex's car and themselves in seconds. The first bike pulled alongside the car on the left. Boone, the president's patch briefly visible through the window as he matched speed, and looked through the glass at Dex. Dex looked back. One nod. Both directions. The kind of communication that required no words because the words were understood before the moment. Then Boone moved past the car and ahead, and the other bikes organized themselves around the car in a formation that was not accidental. 2 ahead, 2 flanking, 1 behind, covering the approach from the rear units. The 3 county vehicles behind them had slowed. They were calculating. 6 motorcycles and a civilian car. Route 9 westbound, forming up against 3 law enforcement units dispatched on a private channel by men whose names were in a federal evidence package but who were not yet in custody. The calculation the county units were doing was the calculation of men who had been given an order by people with reach and were now seeing the order become complicated in a public way, on a state road, with witnesses and headlights and the increasing certainty that whatever cover this action had enjoyed in the planning stage was evaporating. The 3 units slowed further. Then one of them peeled off the road and stopped on the shoulder. Then the second. The third held for another 10 seconds. The specific hesitation of someone on a phone receiving instructions that were changing in real time, and then pulled off. They stopped. They didn't leave. They stopped on the shoulder of Route 9 and sat there with their dark headlights and their dark light bars and their increasingly complicated situation, and the convoy of bikes and 1 civilian car moved past them and continued west through the fog. Inside Dex's car, Lily said, from the back seat, "Are those motorcycles protecting us?" Dex looked at her in the rear view for a second. "Yeah," he said. "They are." Lily looked out the window at the bikes alongside the car, at the leather and the chrome and the exhaust catching in the fog. She pressed her face slightly closer to the glass. "Okay," she said, softly, as if she'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. They drove another 2 miles before the bike slowed and Boone pulled alongside the car again, and this time Dex read the signal correctly and took the next turnoff. A rural junction with a gas station on the corner, closed at this hour, the pumps dark. A gravel overflow lot beside the building. They pulled in. The bikes followed. Engines cut. The silence after that many engines was always specific, not quiet exactly, but a particular quality of absence, where the sound had been, the way a room feels after a very loud noise has stopped. Boone was off his bike and at the car door before the engine had fully ticked down. Dex got out. They looked at each other for a moment. "Units pulled off," Dex said. "Yeah," Boone said. "Cypher's been on the federal contact the whole ride. The Columbus agent made 3 calls in the last 6 minutes. One of those units ran, the other 2 are sitting on the shoulder waiting for direction that isn't going to come." He paused. "The names Hale gave us, the judge and the oversight board member. The agent is moving on them tonight. Not in 47 minutes. Now. The moment those names landed on a federal line, the timeline accelerated." Dex pushed his glasses up. "The units dispatched against us. County Sheriff's Command will have a conversation with their officers before morning," Boone said. "How that conversation goes depends on what those officers decide to say about who gave the order and why they ran dark." He looked at Dex. "Either way, it's federal now. Everything is federal now. It's above the level where local arrangements mean anything." The back door of the car opened. Sarah got out. She looked at the bikes, at the men near them, at the dark gas station, and the gravel lot, and the fog on the fields. She looked the way people looked when the adrenaline was spending itself out and the body was beginning to present its actual report. The shaky quality at the edges of the stillness, the too careful way of moving. She looked at Boone. "Is it over?" she said. Boone looked at her. "The part that was coming for you," he said. "Yes." She took that in, held it. Then she turned and opened the back door and reached inside and came out with Lily in her arms. Not because Lily couldn't walk, but because Sarah needed to be holding her, needed the weight and the specific reality of the child against her chest. Lily put her arms around her mother's neck and her face into the curve of her mother's shoulder. They stood in the gravel lot in the dark and the fog and said nothing. Nobody looked at them directly. The bikers found things to look at in other directions. The road, the dark fields, their own hands. The specific courtesy of men who understood that some things needed space around them. Daniel was leaning against Bull's bike. Boone walked to him. His brother looked worse in the gravel lot light than he'd looked in the warehouse. The swelling around the eye had continued its work, and the cut along the brow had reopened slightly at some point during the ride. A thin, dark line reopened at its center. He was holding himself with the careful posture of managed pain, one hand braced against the bike's seat. Sal was there, had been there, was saying something low about the jaw and about a hospital. "Later," Daniel said. "It could be later, Sal." Sal looked at Boone. Boone gave him a small nod. Sal stepped back. The 2 brothers looked at each other. 11 years. Boone had rehearsed this moment, early on. In the first year after the phone call, he'd run through versions of it. What he'd say, what he'd ask, the shape of the conversation. He'd stopped rehearsing it somewhere around year 3, when the certainty that there would never be a conversation to rehearse for had hardened into something he'd decided to accept. He'd carried the acceptance for 8 years. It had become part of the weight, part of the inventory under his sternum, one of the fixed facts of his life. And then a 6-year-old had sat alone on a sidewalk, and he'd knelt down, and the chain of things that followed had led here. He said, "Who told me?" Daniel looked at him. 11 years ago, Boone said. "Who told me you were dead?" A pause. The fog moved. "Our father," Daniel said. The word landed with the weight of a word that had not been spoken between them in much longer than 11 years. "He thought it was the right thing," Daniel said. "I was going under, deep. The operation I was entering, so it wasn't the kind of thing you tell your family about and then come back to family dinners. There's a protocol. You sever, completely." He looked at the ground, then back up. "I told him not to tell you anything. He decided on his own that telling you I was dead was cleaner than telling you I was gone. He thought—" He stopped. "He thought you'd look for me, if you knew I was alive and just gone." "He was right," Boone said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "He was." Another pause. "Is he—" Boone started. "Last year," Daniel said. "March." Boone absorbed that. He stood very still and absorbed it, the way you absorb the second impact in a sequence of impacts, when the body has already spent its initial response and has to manage the new information on diminished reserves. Their father. March. A year in which Boone had been doing whatever he'd been doing in March. Writing, probably, managing the club, existing in the life he'd built in the absence of the family that had fractured at its foundation long before either phone call. "I didn't know how to find you," Daniel said. His voice had changed. The operational cadence was gone. The controlled delivery of a man trained to communicate under pressure. What was under it was something older and less managed. "I didn't know if you'd... After 11 years, I didn't know what finding you would mean, what it would look like, whether you'd..." "Daniel," Boone said. His brother stopped. "I'm here," Boone said. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was not an accounting of what was owed or what had been taken or what 11 years of a wrong fact felt like to carry. It was simpler than any of that. The specific, unembellished statement of a man standing in a gravel lot in the fog next to his brother, who was alive, who was injured, who was going to need a hospital and a federal debrief and a very long conversation at some point in the near future. It was here. It was enough for now. Daniel looked at him for a moment with his one open eye. Something went out of his face. Not tears, nothing that explicit. Just a release of tension in the muscles around the eye and the jaw. The expression of a man who has been carrying something at pressure for a long time and has just been given somewhere to set part of it down. "You need a doctor," Boone said. "I know. Tonight." "I know, Boone. And then you need to talk to the federal contact, fully, all of it." "That was always going to happen." He paused. "The operation is complete now. Hale, the judge, the oversight board member. There's enough in the package Cypher sent and in what I can provide to close every layer of it." He looked at his brother. 8 months. That's what it took. And it took you showing up to a grocery store parking lot to actually close it." 6-year-old, Boone said. "I know." Daniel said it quietly. The complicated expression again. "I know about Lily." "You made a decision tonight," Boone said, "to let it proceed, the escalation." Daniel didn't look away. "Yes." "She was alone for 3 hours." "Yes." "You're going to have to carry that." "I know that." Boone looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked away toward the road, toward the fog and the flat dark of the Ohio fields and the distant amber of the town lights. "So will I," he said, "for not finding you sooner." That was the accounting. That was all of it. Not equal, not clean, not resolved in a way that felt like resolution. Just two men in a gravel lot acknowledging the weight of their specific errors in the presence of each other, which was a different thing than carrying those errors alone, and was the only version of resolution that was available to people who lived in the actual world. Cypher appeared from near the bikes. "Columbus just called. Federal assets are on scene at the Crane Lake property. Hale is in custody. The 2 county units on Route 9 have been contacted by County Command and ordered to stand down. The command came from the county attorney directly, which means the judge situation is already moving." He looked at Boone. "It's done." Boone looked at the road. "It's done." He let that land. He let it mean what it meant. Not everything, not the conversation with Daniel or the 11 years or the weight in its full inventory, but the specific thing that tonight had been about. Sarah and Lily, the warehouse, the dark units on Route 9, the name Victor Hale, and the documents on the folding table and the zip ties, and a little girl in a pink jacket who had been alone on a concrete step for 3 hours because the visible machinery of care had failed and nobody had stopped. It was done. He breathed in. He breathed out. "There's a diner," Dex said from somewhere to his left. 2 miles, open 24 hours. I've eaten there twice. The coffee is not good." A pause. "But it's hot," Dex said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Rook said, "I could eat." The diner was called Patsy's, and it had been open since 1987, and it had the specific quality of diners that had survived every economic cycle in their county by being exactly what they were with no ambition to be anything else. Vinyl booths in dark red, laminate tables, overhead lighting that was brighter than necessary and somehow forgiving anyway, a counter with round stools along the window, and a smell that was coffee and bacon grease and the particular warmth of a space that had been continuously heated for decades. They took 2 booths and the counter stools. It was past midnight. The night shift waitress, mid-50s, hair pinned up with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before most of the people at her tables had been born, looked at the group as they came through the door with the professional assessment of a woman who had seen most categories of late-night diner patron and placed them correctly. She looked at the leather cuts and the road wear and the various states of damage on various faces. She looked at the woman with the child on her hip. She got menus. Lily had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms before they'd reached the diner and had been transferred to the booth bench with her jacket folded under her head, and she slept with the absolute totality of a child whose body had made a unilateral decision that consciousness was no longer sustainable. Sarah sat beside her with one hand resting on Lily's back, not the hand that moved with her breathing, but the hand that was there, steady, making the particular assurance that sleeping children need without knowing they need it. The coffee arrived. Dex was right. It was not good. Everyone drank it. Boone sat at the counter rather than the booth. He didn't particularly know why. Not distance, not separation. Just the counter, the stool, the specific quality of a diner counter at midnight that was its own kind of stillness. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the steam rising from the surface. He heard the stool beside him take weight. He looked. Daniel had sat down beside him. His eye was worse in the diner light. The cut had been closed with two of Sal's butterfly strips, which held it but made the surrounding area look more dramatic than it would once the swelling receded. He was holding his coffee mug with both hands, same as Boone, same grip. And Boone looked at that for a moment, the identical gesture, the shared posture, the thing genetics did that was indifferent to 11 years of absence. They sat at the counter and drank bad coffee and didn't speak for a while. Behind them, in the booths, the shape of the group reassembled. Rook ordered eggs. Bull ordered the full plate. Ghost drank coffee and read the laminated menu with the focus of a man reading a very interesting document. Sal was doing something on his phone. The federal contact number, probably, arranging the medical and debrief logistics for Daniel. Cypher had his tablet in his hands and was doing what Cypher always did, which was finishing the thing, making sure the transmission was clean, the file complete, the package airtight. Sarah's sister had been called. She was driving from Dayton, 2 hours. She would be there before 3. Sarah sat with her hand on her sleeping daughter and drank coffee and periodically looked at the bikers around her with an expression that was trying to find the right category for what she was seeing and kept arriving at one that didn't have a common name. The expression of a person in the presence of an unexpected kindness that was delivered without request for acknowledgement, and who didn't know the correct response and had decided the correct response was simply to be present in it. She looked at Boone at the counter. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the steam from his mug. She looked at him for a moment anyway. Then she looked at her daughter's face, slack and young and entirely unguarded in the specific way of deep sleep, and she kept her hand on Lily's back and breathed. Boone said to Daniel, without looking at him, "When it's done, the debrief, the testimony, all of it, what happens to you?" Daniel turned his mug on the counter. "Depends on what they decide to do with the embed identity. If Cole Briggs is burned publicly in the federal case, which he probably is, given the scope, I'll need a full resettlement. New identity, new position." He paused. "Or I get out." "Out. Out," Daniel said. "I've been under for 8 months. Before that, 4 years on a different operation. Before that," he stopped. 13 years, Boone. "I've been someone else for 13 years. Boone said nothing. "I don't know if I know how to be Daniel Mercer anymore," he said. "I don't know what that means, what he looks like, where he lives." He turned the mug again. "I don't know if he has anyone who knew him before." Boone looked at his coffee. "He's got one person," he said. The diner held the quiet of late-night diners. Not silence, but the specific frequency of a place where noise has lowered to the level of background existence. Someone at the far end of the counter eating pie. The sound of the kitchen. The occasional clink of a spoon, the waitress moving between tables with the unhurried competence of a woman at the end of a long shift who had stopped performing energy she didn't have. Rook appeared at the counter beside Boone, leaning against it rather than sitting, holding his mug. He looked at Daniel for a moment. Daniel looked back at him. Rook said, "For what it's worth." Daniel said, "What?" "The 6-year-old is fine." He paused. "What you did tonight, what you let happen, you're going to carry it. I know that, but she's fine." He looked at his mug. I'm not saying it makes it equal. I'm saying she's fine. It was the most Rook had said to someone he'd been angry at in a single statement in the years Boone had known him. Boone recognized it for what it was. The specific generosity of a man who led with his protective instinct and had to work backward from it to forgiveness, and who did that work because the work was worth doing. Daniel said, "Thank you." Rook went back to his booth. The food arrived. At some point after the food, in the low interval between the eating and the next cup of coffee, Lily woke up. She didn't wake with the confusion of a child disoriented by an unfamiliar place. She woke the way she had been awake before, directly, eyes open, taking in the room from the booth bench with her jacket still folded under her head. She looked at her mother. She looked at the diner. She looked at the bikers in the booths and at the counter. She sat up. She found Boone at the counter. She slid out of the booth. Sarah made a small sound, reached for her, then stopped, reading the direction and letting it go, and walked across the diner floor in her cartoon rabbit sneakers to the counter and climbed up onto the stool beside Daniel. She looked at Daniel's face. "You got hurt," she said. "A little," Daniel said. "Does it hurt?" "A little." She looked at him with the direct assessment of a child who had decided the answer was acceptable. Then she looked at Boone. "Did you keep your promise?" she said. Boone looked at her. "You said you were going to find her," Lily said. "Yeah," Boone said. "We found her." Lily looked at her mother across the diner. Sarah was watching from the booth, and her face was the face of a woman who had reached the bottom of the night and found something still there. Not certainty, not safety in the permanent sense that nobody can actually provide, but this room, this booth, this hour, her daughter on a counter stool talking to a man with a scar on his jaw. Lily turned back to the counter. She pulled her purple backpack around. She'd been wearing it since the parking lot, the clip buckle still unclipped, and opened it. She rummaged in the small interior with the serious focus of a child on a mission. She produced a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it on the counter. It was a crayon drawing. Done in the supermarket, probably, while she was waiting. The paper was torn from somewhere, the back of a receipt or a page from the small notebook that had spilled from Sarah's bag. The wax marks were thick and decisive with the specific confidence of a 6-year-old artist who doesn't question her choices. 7 motorcycles in a row. A small figure beside them, pink jacket, purple backpack, white shoes. Above the whole scene, a large yellow star. She pushed it across the counter to Boone. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. At the motorcycles rendered in the certain imprecision of crayon. At the small figure with the backpack. At the yellow star above everything. He picked it up carefully. He folded it along its original crease. He folded it again, making it smaller, handling it with the deliberate care of something that was going into a specific place. He tucked it into the interior pocket of his jacket, against the left side, against where the weight lived. Lily watched him do it. "So you remember," she said. Boone looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "so I remember." Outside, past the diner windows, the October dark was beginning to shift. Not yet light, not the visible change of dawn, but the subtle alteration in the quality of darkness that preceded it. The first suggestion of the world reconsidering its position. The fog was still on the fields, the road was still empty. But something in the air had changed, the way the air always changed in that hour, before the hour you could point to and say the sun is up. The hour that was neither one thing nor the other, and was in some ways the most honest hour for that reason. Cypher put his tablet away. It was the first time all night he'd done that. Ghost ordered more coffee and said nothing, which was exactly what Ghost always did, and which was its own kind of statement. Sal had arranged the hospital logistics. Daniel was going in at 6, with federal documentation already transmitted, the debrief scheduled to follow. It was handled. The sequence was in place. Sarah's sister arrived at 2:47 a.m. in a 10-year-old Subaru that pulled into the diner parking lot with a speed that communicated 2 hours of highway driving with a specific kind of urgency. She was older than Sarah, heavier through the face, and she came through the diner door and across the floor and had Sarah in her arms before she'd finished scanning the room, and the sound the two sisters made was a compressed, wordless version of the same collision Lily and Sarah had made in the supermarket, the same fundamental physics of people who belong to each other, reaching each other after the distance. Lily stood on the counter stool and watched. Then her aunt saw her and opened the embrace wider. Lily got down from the stool. She walked to her mother and her aunt and went in. The three of them stood in a diner in Carver Falls, Ohio at 2:47 in the morning, and the bikers in the booths and at the counter looked at other things and let the reunion have its space. At 4 in the morning, the Iron Hollow riders left Patsy's diner. They left in the way they'd arrived at the supermarket, one by one, not all at once, the engines starting sequentially in the parking lot until all 6 were running. Daniel had already been taken to the hospital in Sal's truck, Sal going with him, staying with him, because that was the kind of man Sal was, and there was no conversation required about it. Sarah had watched them go from the diner window. When Boone stood from his counter stool and put money under his mug and turned toward the door, she got up from the booth. She crossed the diner. She stopped in front of him. She was a small woman, and she was exhausted, and she was going to be dealing with the aftermath of tonight for a long time. The federal paperwork, the legal resolution of the debt that didn't exist, the practical reconstruction of a life that had been operating under threat for months. That was all ahead of her. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said anything about it. She looked at him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to," Boone said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached forward and briefly put her hand against his arm. Not a handshake, not an embrace, something smaller and more specific, the particular gesture of a person acknowledging presence rather than gratitude, the recognition of a person who was there. Then she stepped back. Boone walked through the door. In the parking lot, the bikes were running. The 6 men of the Iron Hollow riders stood near their machines in the pre-dawn dark of a Wednesday morning in October, and the air smelled like exhaust and wet asphalt, and the first faint suggestion of morning cold, which was a different cold than night cold, thinner, less permanent, the cold of something that was already in the process of changing. Boone stood at his bike. He looked at his men. Rook, who was difficult and loyal and had sat with a sleeping child's mother in a hospital waiting room once without being asked and had never mentioned it. Bull, who spoke rarely and was present absolutely, a wall that had chosen a direction to face and faced it. Ghost, whose name was exactly right and who had earned it in ways that were not discussed. Cypher, whose skills had come from a life he'd stepped out of and whose presence in this one was not accidental. Dex, with his wire-rimmed glasses and his gray beard and the 8-second gap he'd left in the supermarket parking lot before getting Sarah and Lily out, which was exactly the right amount of gap, enough to confirm the threat, short enough to be relevant. Men he'd ridden with for years, men who had come to a grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday and had not gone home when they could have. He put his helmet on. He started his bike. The others mounted. The engines rose together to the specific combined frequency of 6 Harleys at idle, the sound settling into its own rhythm, that low collective pulse that had been the first thing Lily had heard before she'd seen them in the parking lot, when she was alone and cold and the world had been moving past her without stopping. They'd stopped. That was the whole story. Boone looked at the diner window. Inside, through the glass, he could see the booth. Sarah and her sister and Lily, the 3 of them in the yellow diner light, Lily pressed against her mother's side. Sarah's arm around her, the aunt's hand on the table. The waitress was pouring coffee. The steam rose. Lily was looking out the window. She saw him. She raised one hand, small, the specific gesture of a 6-year-old who had learned tonight that some things you hold on to and some things you let go, and had decided this was the second kind, but wanted to mark it first. Boone raised his hand. Then he looked at the road. He rolled out of the parking lot onto Route 9 eastbound, and behind him the others came, one by one, until the formation was complete. 7 machines, 6 riders, moving together through the pre-dawn dark of Harmon County, Ohio, the fog still thin on the fields, the sky beginning its first reluctant consideration of light at the edge of the world. The engines found their road rhythm. The town receded behind them. Dangerous men. Broken men. Men who carried weight in the place behind the sternum, where weight accumulates when you've been in the world long enough and paid attention, and who had learned to ride with it rather than put it down, because putting it down was not a thing the world had taught them how to do. Men who had found, in leather and road and the company of other men who understood the same things, a kind of family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with showing up. They rode east into the edge of the morning. The engines ran. The world opened ahead of them, flat and wide and cold, and full of the particular promise of early light on empty road. The promise that is not certainty, that is not safety, that does not come with guarantees or easy mornings or the absence of wait, but that is there anyway, every day, on the far side of the dark. The kind of promise that is enough. The Iron Hollow riders disappeared into it, and the road behind them was empty, and the neon sign above the Harmon Square supermarket was still flickering, the H still dark, the S still pulsing, 4-second intervals, weak and steady. And the concrete steps in front of it were cold and bare and clean. Nobody sitting on them. Not anymore.